September 17, 1851. Canvas army tents and wagons stood in a rough arc on the flats near Horse Creek, downriver from Fort Laramie, while a vast encampment of teepees ringed the horizon. On that clear late summer day, United States officers in blue coats walked between tight lines of Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara leaders. Horses shifted in the dust, rifle barrels glinted in the sun, and translators moved from knot to knot of men, carrying each phrase across languages that had seldom trusted one another. The council at Horse Creek aimed to turn this contested country into lines on a government map so that wagon roads could cut straight through without an arrow loosed or a shot fired. The treaty commissioners laid out their terms in careful, formal words. The United States acknowledged that all the land around them belonged to the nations gathered at the council, and claimed none of it. In return for peace between tribes and protection for emigrant roads, the government promised an annual payment worth $50,000 in goods for 50 years. Provisions that were supposed to help Native families adapt to the pressure of a growing flood of travelers. The tribes agreed that settlers on the Oregon and California trails would have safe passage and that the Army could build roads and forts in their territories. The treaty required each nation to control its own young men, to restrain raids on neighbors, and to repay any damages taken from travelers. On paper, the agreement divided the northern plains into distinct homelands. The Crow received a wide domain stretching along the Yellowstone River and its big southern branches, including the Rosebud, Tongue, Bighorn, and Powder rivers. To the east, the Lakota bands were confirmed in their broad Missouri River country and the rolling plains that led toward the edge of the Black Hills. The Cheyenne and Arapaho held ground further south along the Platte and Arkansas. The treaty text described boundaries in long lists of rivers, mountains, and ridge lines. One of those lines ran along the Powder River, marking the western edge of Lakota territory and the eastern limit of Crow hunting grounds. The paper asserted that these borders would tame long-standing rivalries and keep each nation on its side of the new lines. Reality in the plains did not bend easily to Washington's language. The tribes had fought for generations over the best grazing valleys and the richest buffalo range. And those conflicts did not stop because the commissioners stacked inked treaty copies in an army chest. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors already pushed west toward the Bighorn Mountains, testing Crow strength along the very rivers that Eastern politicians thought they had settled with a paragraph. Winter counts in Lakota camps noted battles with the Crow as markers for whole years, and Crow storytellers remembered camps that had to pull back from the Powder River valleys when pressure mounted. For both sides, the Powder River country represented meat, horses, and status, not a neutral line traced on a distant surveyor's sheet. The stream of Americans rolling west pressed harder each season. Long strings of white-topped wagons moved along the North Platte and through the corridor around Fort Laramie, drawn first by the California gold fields and then by promises of rich land in Oregon. Oxen and cattle grazed the same grass that bison, elk, and native pony herds needed to survive the winter. Children in emigrant trains picked up bison bones for firewood because the plains already showed scars from previous seasons of travel, and game near the beaten roads grew scarce. Soldiers at the forts were supposed to protect not only the wagon trains but also the native hunting grounds, keeping emigrants from spreading out across treaty land. That duty clashed constantly with the demand from settlers to cut hay, graze stock, and look for minerals in any place they thought useful. Tension near Fort Laramie boiled into open killing in late summer 1854. A single wandering cow from an emigrant train strayed into a Brule Lakota camp near the post and was butchered, as hungry people did whenever meat appeared. Instead of accepting the offer of horses in compensation, Lieutenant John Grattan marched from the fort with a small detachment, determined to arrest the man blamed for killing the animal. He dragged a howitzer along the way, a show of force on a small, fragile stage. Conquering Bear, the respected Brûlé headman, stood before his lodges and tried to keep the peace while interpreters fumbled words and tempers rose. A rifle cracked. Conquering Bear fell with a torn abdomen, and the Lakota fighters surged around the soldiers. Every member of Grattan's party died in the dust and smoke. When other troops reached the site later, they found bodies scattered in the grass, stripped and mutilated according to the warriors' customs of revenge. The following year, the army answered with a punishing campaign. General William Harney led a strong column northwest and found a Lakota camp near Blue Water Creek, close to Ash Hollow in present-day Nebraska. At dawn, his mounted troopers and infantry rolled down on the teepees. Warriors tried to form a rear guard while women, children, and the elderly ran for the bluffs, but the soldiers pressed forward with rifles and bayonets. By the end of the fighting at Ash Hollow, at least 86 Lakota lay dead, many of them women and children who had been shot or bayoneted while trying to flee. Soldiers burned teepees, food stores, and piles of buffalo robes, the winter wealth of the camp. Survivors carried memories of that day into later councils, proof that United States promises of protection could turn into organized slaughter. Through the late 1850s and early 1860s, violence spread out along the whole frontier. The Pikes Peak Gold Rush drew miners into Colorado and the mountain districts that had been marked as Cheyenne and Arapaho land in the Fort Laramie Treaty. Towns grew on streams that treaty negotiators had listed as native hunting grounds. The government did not hold settlers back. Instead, officials tried to compress tribes into smaller reservations and buy away claims piece by piece. In November 1864, Colorado volunteers under Colonel John Chivington descended on a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho camp along Sand Creek. At dawn, they opened fire with rifles and howitzers on men, women, and children who had gathered near a United States flag. Mutilated bodies were carried back as trophies. For many Cheyenne and Arapaho families, Sand Creek erased any belief that treaties or flags would shield them. The Powder River country grew still more important as pressure mounted further south. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho bands shifted northward, looking for bison herds untouched by major emigrant routes. The long valleys of the Powder, Tongue, and Rosebud rivers offered timbered bottoms, clear water, and good wintering ground along the eastern slopes of the Bighorn Mountains. Crow camps, once spread across those same valleys, retreated toward the upper Yellowstone. By the early 1860s, Lakota and their allies hunted freely west of the Powder River line that the 1851 treaty had marked as their limit, regarding the region as country taken in war from the Crow. That shift set native control of the ground directly against the United States paper promise to the Crow Nation, a contradiction that stood at the center of every later argument. Far to the northwest in 1862 and 1863, prospectors uncovered rich gold deposits at Bannock on Grasshopper Creek and then along Alder Gulch, where Virginia City soon rose. Word spread that men could wash fortunes from Montana gravel bars. Within 2 years, thousands of miners and camp followers crowded into gulches that had been almost empty of Americans only a short time before. The new towns needed flour, tools, whiskey, and all the other freight that made life possible in a mining camp. Freight wagons had to reach them from the east, and every freight route shaved or added hard weeks to a journey over plains and mountains. In 1863, a Georgia-born frontiersman named John Bozeman and his associate John Jacobs measured a shortcut to the Montana gold fields. Instead of swinging far south and then north again, their line led from the North Platte near Fort Laramie up the valleys of the Powder and Tongue and on toward the Yellowstone, then across a pass in the mountains to the new camps. It traced an old native corridor that had carried Crow, Lakota, and Cheyenne war parties for generations. Wagons on this route cut days off the trip, but every mile crossed ground where Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho now hunted and camped. The treaty had promised the United States right to establish roads and forts. It had not cleared with those nations any specific path for this new trail. The first small parties to try the Bozeman route reached Montana with little interference, but once word spread, the trickle became deliberate movement. In 1864, 4 large wagon trains left the North Platte bound over the Bozeman Road. One was the Townsend train, more than 150 wagons and hundreds of people from Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. When that train rolled near the Powder River in early July, Lakota and Cheyenne fighters moved against it. Arrows and bullets struck men and oxen at close range, and women and children crouched under wagon beds as splinters flew from the hits. The emigrants circled their wagons, dug shallow pits, and fired back with a mix of long rifles and newer repeating arms until the attackers pulled away. Several men died, and the trail gained a reputation as a corridor that would not be passed without blood. The pattern repeated up and down the Central Plains. In 1864 and 1865, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho war parties hit stage stations, small ranches, and scattered trains from the Little Blue River in Nebraska to the Platte crossings in what is now Wyoming. Ranch buildings burned. Stage stock was driven off. Families trying to escape in wagons found themselves chased across open prairie. The aim was to push an unwanted invasion back from key rivers and hunting grounds, not to stand in line of battle against regular army formations. Each dead teamster or burned way station sent a message that the road west cut through land whose owners did not grant free passage. Between 1864 and 1868, official records noted more than 150 attacks, skirmishes, and stock raids tied to this growing resistance. With the Civil War winding down and public outrage rising over losses on the plains, the Army responded with a new large-scale campaign into the Powder River country in 1865. Major General Grenville Dodge ordered 3 converging columns toward the valleys north of the Platte. In total, 2,675 officers, enlisted men, civilian teamsters, and Indian scouts moved into the region. Brigadier General Patrick Connor pushed north along the line that would soon be known as the Bozeman Trail, building a post on the upper Powder that he named Fort Connor, later called Fort Reno. His instructions were blunt and harsh, directing him to make war on the tribes whose warriors had struck the overland routes. The force carried Civil War period muzzle-loading rifles, some repeating carbines, and a pair of small mountain howitzers, along with long wagon trains of food and ammunition that stretched vulnerability across miles of rough ground. On August 29, 1865, Connor used the mobility and firepower of his column to hit an Arapaho village on the Tongue River. Guided by Jim Bridger and preceded by Pawnee, Omaha, and Winnebago scouts, 200 cavalrymen and attached artillery pieces swept into a camp of roughly 500 Arapaho people. Many of the younger warriors were away on a raid against the Crow, leaving old men, women, and children to absorb the first shock. Howitzer shells burst among the lodges while troopers charged in, firing carbines at close range. Teepees collapsed in flame. Families ran for the cottonwoods and ravines along Wolf Creek as scouts and soldiers seized the horse herd. In the chase that followed, Arapaho warriors fought a delaying action, firing from cover with scarce gunpowder and older muskets, while Connor's men kept up a steady rate with better supplied weapons. By the time the soldiers pulled back toward Fort Connor, scores of Arapaho lay dead, nearly all the lodges were burned, and hundreds of horses and ponies had been driven off. The expedition did not end native resistance in the Powder River country. Arapaho survivors of the Tongue River attack joined Lakota and Cheyenne relatives in renewed determination to hold the northern plains. That same summer, Cheyenne and Lakota fighters struck Colonel Sawyer's road-building expedition at Bonepile Creek and later along the Tongue, killing soldiers and civilians and pinning the wagon train in a defensive corral for days until Connor's troops reached it. In scattered fights along the Platte and Powder, soldiers and warriors died in small groups, burned under the sun or frozen in cold river water, their bodies left in places where only scavengers and relatives would find them. By autumn, Connor's columns had withdrawn south again. Fort Connor remained on the Upper Powder as a lonely symbol of United States intent, but the country around it belonged in fact to the native nations whose camps still filled the valleys. The army had opened a track and planted a post. It had not broken the people who lived around that trail. By the end of 1865, the conditions for the next collision stood in place. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 had recognized native ownership of the plains and granted the United States limited rights for roads and forts. Miners in Colorado and Montana, hungry for gold, had dragged the United States far beyond those limits. The Powder River country, once marked as Crow land, now functioned as the main hunting ground of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho families. The Bozeman Trail cut straight through that living heart. A chain of raids and retaliations had already soaked the ground with blood, yet the army still believed it could secure a permanent road at the end of a wagon track and a row of wooden palisades. In the coming year, soldiers, officers, and native leaders would test that belief face to face along the new forts and ridgelines above the trail. June to July, 1866. June sunlight hit the parade ground at Fort Laramie hard, baking the packed earth between the log barracks and the stone officers' quarters. The Civil War had ended the previous year, yet the post still held the look of a campaign camp. Rifles stood in stacked pyramids near the guardhouse. Artillery pieces waited beside the flagstaff, their black barrels elevated toward a sky that had watched countless wagon trains pass along the North Platte. Into that heat rode Colonel Henry B.B. Carrington of the 18th United States Infantry, carrying written orders that would pull the army deep into the Powder River country and straight into the path of Red Cloud's warriors. Carrington had built his reputation as an organizer rather than a battlefield hero. During the war, he had raised troops and guarded railroads instead of leading charges. His superiors valued his care with supply tables and marching plans. Now those skills were exactly what the War Department demanded. The 18th Infantry, reinforced by companies of the 2nd Cavalry and a bundle of civilian teamsters, carpenters, blacksmiths, and family members, had been assigned to establish and hold a line of posts along the Bozeman Trail to the Montana gold fields. The paper orders in his dispatch case told him to protect emigrants and freighters, to supervise road construction, and to locate and build forts strong enough to dominate the northern plains. The words did not grant him authority to negotiate the land itself. That question lay on a different table, one surrounded by native leaders and government commissioners. Outside the stockade walls on the flats along the river, teepees clustered in dense rings of canvas and hide. Oglala and Minneconjou Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho families had answered the call to council, their lodges drawn together by ties of marriage and war. Red Cloud, a hard-faced Oglala leader whose reputation came from years of fighting the Crow and other enemies, moved from fire to fire, listening to younger men describe the new wagon road that crossed the Powder River valleys and climbed toward the Bighorn Mountains. Scouts spoke of iron tires cutting fresh tracks beside old war trails and of emigrants firing wildly at any distant rider. The men around Red Cloud knew that the game herds nearest the main Oregon Trail had shrunk badly. They knew that the Powder River country now fed their families. In the post's council room, Army officers and Indian Bureau agents prepared for the gathering as if it were a courtroom session. On one side, A long table held treaty copies, inkstands, rows of metal piece medals, and stacks of bright cloth and small tools that would serve as the first demonstration of promised goods. On the other side, chairs and benches had been assembled for chiefs and headmen who were used to speaking while standing among their own people. Translators rehearsed phrases in Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. They had to carry more than simple sentences. Every misinterpreted word could turn a promise into an insult. When the native leaders came in, they brought the quiet intensity of men who had seen many promises broken. Red Cloud sat slightly apart near other Oglala headmen. Man afraid of his horses, a prominent leader who had often dealt with the army, took a place where the commissioners could see him clearly. Cheyenne and Arapaho representatives whose homelands had already been cut up by gold seekers and militia violence farther south studied every gesture at the table. The meeting began with set speeches from the government side. The commissioners recited the peace language of the earlier Fort Laramie Treaty and reminded their listeners that they had once agreed to protect the main wagon road and allow forts along it. Then they outlined the new demand: a road from the Platte to the Montana mines running through the Powder River valleys needed to be made safe. To accomplish that, the Army planned to send Carrington and his regiment north, to build and hold posts along the route and to keep the trail open in every season. The commissioners described the Bozeman route as a simple change in travel directions. In their telling, it did not alter anything essential. White travelers would still cross Indian country under the protection of treaties. The Army would still stand between emigrant trains and hostile raiders. What changed, they insisted, was only the line of march, a shorter path that would save time and reduce hardships. They spoke of freighters and miners, of hungry families in distant Montana camps waiting for flour and tools that could not easily be dragged over longer routes. They promised that, if the road were accepted, the government would deliver more regular annuities, schools, and mills. When Red Cloud answered, he did not treat the proposal as a minor adjustment. He rose and pointed north toward the line of low hills that hid the Powder River valleys behind them. In his words, that whole country belonged to the Lakota and their allies by right of conquest. The Crow, he said, had been driven away from those hunting grounds by long, hard fighting. The land fed Lakota children now. Herds of buffalo and antelope still moved through its grass. Camps ringed its creeks in winter. To let soldiers build forts there would mean surrendering the heart of their strength. He reminded the commissioners that the earlier treaty had recognized native ownership, and that government agents had promised to keep white settlers off the best hunting ground. Each new road had broken that promise again. Other speakers followed. Some shared Red Cloud's anger. Some, like Man afraid of his horses, argued for caution. They pointed out that the villages needed trade goods and that war with the United States might bring heavy losses. They asked whether the new posts in the Powder River country would truly be limited to protecting the road. They wanted to know whether the forts would be abandoned if the Montana mines failed and the traffic faded. The commissioners could not give those assurances. Once built, Army posts seldom disappeared quietly. Around the table, mistrust thickened with every exchange. Outside the room, Carrington walked the parade ground and calculated distances. He knew from his instructions that his column would move in several stages. One segment would reoccupy and strengthen the post already standing on the upper Powder that officers now called Fort Reno. Another would push farther north to select a site near the fork where creeks from the Bighorn foothills met the trail. A third would watch the northern end near the Yellowstone. Each point would require its own stockade, blockhouses, magazines, and saw pits. Each would need thousands of logs and boards cut from timber stands along streams that native families used for their own lodges and fuel. Every log he planned to fell would be taken from someone else's winter shelter. In the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho camp, war leaders held their own talks around evening fires. Younger men who had grown up hearing of the wagon road killings near the Platte and the slaughtered villages at Sand Creek and along the Tongue pushed for open resistance. Older men who had seen smallpox and hunger sweep through lodges even in peaceful years weighed the cost of meeting columns of regular infantry and cavalry on open ground. The lodges around them held families who had already been pushed north by pressure in Colorado and Nebraska. The Powder River valleys were not simply familiar. They were the last reliable place to find meat in large numbers. If those valleys filled with forts and patrols, there would be no safe refuge left. The council at the fort stretched over days, with pauses while translators tried to untangle disputed phrases and riders carried messages between the camp and other bands nearby. During one of those pauses, soldiers from Carrington's regiment began to march north along the trail. Their blue coats, stacked arms, and wagon columns formed a moving wall of canvas and iron that could be seen from the native camp. Red Cloud watched that movement and understood its meaning clearly. While words were still being traded inside the post, the army had already decided that the road would be built. The talk inside the council house sounded to him like an attempt to cover action that had begun without consent. When the commissioners called the leaders back to resume the meeting, Red Cloud came, but his patience had vanished. Inside the room, he listened briefly while officials spoke again of friendship and mutual benefit. Then he stood and told them that the country along the Powder Tongue and Bighorn streams was his people's land, taken in war and held with blood. He said that no white man would travel the trail or build a house there without resistance. He declared that the soldiers marching north had shown the true intention of the government and that there could be no agreement. With that, he turned and walked out, followed by Oglala Headman, who shared his view. The door closed behind them with a finality that everyone in the room felt. Some leaders remained. Representatives of other bands who feared the consequences of direct war listened while the commissioners pressed for signatures. They were shown lists of promised goods and told that their people would suffer if they broke with Washington. A few put their marks to the paper. From the government's point of view, those signatures were enough to claim permission for the forts and the road. From Red Cloud's point of view, the men who signed did not speak for the warriors who would have to enforce any decision on the open plains. Two very different understandings left that room and spread in opposite directions. Carrington saw only part of this divide. To him, the fact that some leaders had signed the new agreement meant that the army had the authority it needed. On the morning his main column ready to leave Fort Laramie, he posted guards around supply wagons loaded with flour, salt pork, coffee, and hardtack. Boxes of rifle ammunition and kegs of powder sat under canvas covers guarded by sentries who checked every approach. Wagons carried sawmill machinery, blacksmith tools, and iron fittings for gates and doors. A few small field guns rested on their traveling carriages, ready to be unlimbered if columns of riders appeared on the ridges. His infantry companies were armed with muzzle-loading rifle muskets, weapons accurate at long range but slow to reload. A portion of the cavalry carried 7-shot Spencer repeaters, a newer technology that could throw a rapid stream of fire when cartridges were plentiful. Families climbed onto the wagons that held their household goods. Wives of officers and enlisted men, some carrying infants, had chosen to follow the column into what they had been told was a frontier assignment. Civilian carpenters and woodcutters gathered their few possessions, knowing that army pay at a remote post could mean a steady income. As the bugler sounded the call to form ranks, men in dusty blue coats took their places in columns, adjusting blanket rolls and haversacks. The line began to move through the post gate and down the track that led toward the foothills. Dust rose under iron tires and marching feet. From the native camp, riders watched the departure. They counted the wagons and estimated the number of rifles. They saw that the soldiers brought women and children and took that as proof that the army meant to stay through the winter. In Lakota eyes, this was not a temporary escort for travelers. It was a settlement move into the center of their hunting ground. Smoke from the leaving column drifted on the wind and mixed with the cooking fires in the camp. A visible sign that two ways of life were now pushing against each other in the same narrow valley. As Carrington's command moved north along the developing road, reports came in of attacks on small parties traveling without escort. Freighters who tried to push ahead alone were turned back or killed. Isolated stages along other routes were struck in quick raids that left charred walls and empty corrals. Each incident pushed the War Department to demand faster progress and a stronger chain of posts. Each raid convinced more young men in Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho camps that the only answer to new forts would be coordinated war. By the time summer deepened, the lines had been drawn in clear, hard strokes. On one side stood Carrington's regiment, backed by a government in Washington that believed written agreements and earthwork fortifications could secure a road indefinitely. On the other stood Red Cloud and the Allied war leaders who had walked away from Fort Laramie convinced that the talks were a cover for theft. The Bozeman Trail carried wagon wheels and army supply trains into the Powder River country. War songs and council fires in the native camps carried a different message along the same valleys. The next step in that conflict would no longer be set at a negotiation table. It would be marked by rifle fire and the bodies of men on cold ground. On July 15, 1866, soldiers began cutting into the soil on a low bench between the Big and Little Piney Creeks. The site lay at roughly 4,700 feet above sea level, on the eastern slope of the Bighorn Mountains in what would later be called northern Wyoming. To the west, dark pine ridges climbed toward the main range. To the east, rolling grasslands stretched toward the Powder River Basin. The spot gave a clear view of the Bozeman Trail where it crossed the valley, close enough to watch wagon traffic yet far enough from the creek bottoms to avoid spring floods. Carrington marked corners with stakes and paced off lines that would soon hold the largest stockaded fort on that road. The column that reached this ground had left Fort Laramie a month earlier with 700 soldiers, 300 civilians, and more than 200 wagons. Many of the civilians were teamsters, carpenters, blacksmiths, or laborers under Army contract. Others were the wives and children of officers and enlisted men, 21 of whom had already followed Carrington west from an older post in Nebraska. A herd of 1,000 cattle moved with the wagons as a walking meat supply. The marching column included a regimental band that played to steady the step of raw recruits who had never spent a winter on the northern plains. Dust rose from their boots and wagon wheels as they climbed toward the Powder River country, and by the time they reached the Piney Creeks, men and animals were worn down by distance and work. Carrington's orders gave him a clear task. He was to protect the Bozeman Trail, guard emigrants and freight trains, and build a chain of posts strong enough to hold that line through winter. His command, however, had been assembled for construction rather than aggressive campaigning. Around 500 of his soldiers were new recruits with little training. Most belonged to infantry companies armed with muzzle-loading Springfield rifle muskets carried over from the Civil War. These weapons could hit a man at long range when fired by steady hands, but a careful soldier needed close to half a minute to reload under pressure. A portion of his cavalry troopers carried 7-shot Spencer repeaters, reliable carbines that could empty a magazine in seconds, yet ammunition for those repeaters reached the fort in smaller quantities than powder and ball for the older guns. The Army had promised 100,000 rounds before the expedition left Fort Laramie, and delivered much less. From the first day of work, every cut of a shovel and every stroke of an axe carried a double meaning. For Carrington, the stakes he set marked the outline of a permanent base. For Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho scouts watching from the hills now called Pilot Knob and Sullivan Hills, those same cuts showed that the soldiers meant to stay in the center of a vital hunting ground. Riders appeared on distant ridges, counted wagons, and vanished. At night, the glow of campfires within the new fort's lines met the glimmer of fires in native camps further up the creeks. Each side measured the other in silence before most of the men had even seen one another at close range. Construction began with the stockade. Carrington laid out an irregular rectangle that enclosed 17 acres, the military portion covering roughly 600 by 700 feet. The walls would stand 8 feet high, formed by heavy pine logs set upright in a trench and pinned together. The longer faces stretched nearly 1,500 feet along the northeast and southwest sides. Building that barrier demanded more than 4,000 logs cut in the surrounding hills. Soldiers and civilian woodcutters felled trees, trimmed branches, and dragged trunks down from the slopes with teams of mules and oxen. Every log had to be hauled not just for the stockade, but also for barracks, officers' quarters, storehouses, stables, and workshops. The first weeks turned the bench between the creeks into a landscape of piles and half-finished structures. Carpenters framed barracks from rough boards while axe gangs sank posts. Blacksmiths set up forges and began repairing worn shoes on the oxen that pulled wagon loads of timber. A sawmill brought from the east was assembled along a nearby stream, ready to turn raw logs into planks. Inside the growing walls, soldiers dug cellars and refused pits and raised cookhouses. A parade ground took shape in the center where companies could form for roll call and drill. At one side, space was cleared for powder magazines and for a small guardhouse that would hold prisoners in wooden cells. The garrison's numbers on paper gave an impression of strength, yet much of that strength could not be spared for patrols. Men had to cut and haul lumber, dig foundations, herd cattle, and stand guard on the walls. Women set up house in small frame buildings and canvas shelters along one side of the parade ground, cooking over open hearths while their children wandered among stacked boards and piles of tools. At any given moment, a large share of the command stood outside the stockade, unfortified, working in scattered details that spread along the creek bottoms and up the slopes. That constant need for labor created the weakest point in Carrington's position. Fort Phil Kearny depended on resources that lay beyond rifle range of its walls. Firewood and construction timber grew in dense stands of pine and spruce several miles northwest of the post, in an area that soldiers and civilians quickly called the Pinery. Hay for the fort's horses and cattle grew in patches of meadow along the Little Piney. To keep the fort supplied for a single winter, men had to cut and haul thousands of cords of wood and hundreds of tons of hay. Carrington organized regular wood and hay trains, long strings of wagons that left the gate under escort, followed a road across broken country and returned, at evening if they returned at all. By mid-July, war had fully opened along the trail. At Fort Reno on the Powder River, Cheyenne and Lakota fighters stampeded more than 170 horses and mules after infiltrating close to the picket lines. 200 soldiers chased them over 15 miles of rough ground and came back with 2 of their own men dead and several wounded, along with the bodies of 6 civilian traders killed near the post. At Crazy Woman Fork of the Powder River on July 20th, Red Cloud's warriors struck a wagon train of 37 soldiers and civilians, killing 2 and driving home the message that civilian traffic on the Bozeman route would not pass without heavy risk. The impact of those blows spread quickly. Nearly all civilian freighting and emigrant movement along the Bozeman Trail ceased. Carrington's new fort would receive food and ammunition only in heavily guarded Army convoys. Near Fort Phil Kearny, skirmishes began as soon as the wood train started rolling. The Pinery lay roughly 6 miles northwest of the post through gullies, low ridges, and scattered timber. To defend the lumber crews, each wood train went out as two parallel lines of 24 to 40 wagons with mounted soldiers on either flank. When the lookout on Pilot Knob or one of the other hills signaled an attack, the drivers were to form a corral, swinging wagons into a rough rectangle and chaining wheels together. Woodcutters and teamsters would take shelter behind wagon beds while soldiers deployed along the perimeter, rifles resting on the wagon sides. One of the first serious attacks near the new fort came during such a journey. As a train moved toward the pinery, riders appeared along a ridge to the north. They were Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, some with feathered lances and others with rifles or bows. They rode across the front of the column at a distance, shouting insults and firing occasional shots. When the escort wheeled toward them, the riders fell back, drawing the soldiers away from the slow-moving wagons. Then more warriors rose from low ground on the other flank, sending arrows and bullets against the unprotected side of the train. Drivers shouted to their teams and tried to pull the wagons into a defensive ring while traces tangled and oxen bawled. A few animals went down under fire, blocking wheels and leaving gaps in the forming corral. Infantrymen in dark blue coats scrambled from wagon to wagon, dragging wounded men behind cover and returning fire as best they could with the slow-loading Springfield rifles. Cavalrymen with Spencer carbines dismounted and formed a skirmish line, levering shots into the faces of riders who tried to dart close. The air filled with dust thrown up by hooves and the sharp crack of guns mixed with the deeper boom of an occasional howitzer shell from the fort if gunners thought they could reach the attackers. After a short, intense exchange, the warriors pulled away, some circling, beyond range to gather loose stock and drive it off toward the hills. When silence settled, several wagons stood splintered, men and animals lay on the road, and the escort had to decide whether to press on or retreat with what remained. Fights like this repeated through the summer. Between July 16th and September 27th, records from the trail and the fort noted 15 separate attacks near Fort Phil Kearny. Those fights killed 6 soldiers and 28 civilians. Several hundred horses, mules, and cattle were run off. A hay-cutting machine brought to speed the harvest of winter feed was destroyed. Each loss cut into the fort's ability to survive the coming cold season. Each success in driving off stock and snapping at wagon trains strengthened confidence in Red Cloud's camp that the soldiers could be worn down without a direct assault on the walls. Inside the stockade, daily life settled into a grinding routine under constant strain. Reveille sounded before sunrise. Men turned out for roll call in company streets between rows of unfinished barracks. Work details formed for carpentry, ditch digging, wood cutting, haying, and guard mounts. Sentries climbed into small blockhouses at the corners of the walls and watched the ridges. Women hauled water, washed clothing in tubs, and tried to maintain some sense of domestic order while gunfire sounded intermittently in the distance. Children learned to stay close to the interior buildings, warned not to wander near the gates. Carrington kept most of his command on a defensive footing. He focused available manpower on finishing the fort, deepening ditches and strengthening firing positions. That approach angered many of his younger officers who had fought in the Civil War and believed that active pursuit of the enemy showed proper courage. Captain William J. Fetterman, a brevet lieutenant colonel by wartime rank, arrived with reinforcements in November and quickly joined the camp of those who called their commander overly cautious. He and other officers argued that with disciplined troops, the army could chase down any native force that appeared near the fort. They pointed to the size and construction of the stockade as proof that time and labor were being poured into a structure instead of into aggressive operations. The tension between these viewpoints grew sharper as the fort neared completion. By late autumn, the stockade walls stood closed, blockhouses guarded the corners, and most of the interior buildings had roofs. The garrison numbered roughly 400 regular soldiers and 150 civilians, not counting family members. The post's supplies included barrels of flour, pork, beans, and coffee, stacked in warehouses against the cold months that would soon lock the high plains in snow and ice. Yet despite this apparent security, the fort lived under conditions that resembled a siege. Beyond the stout log walls, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors controlled almost every mile of open ground. Scouts watched every wood train that left the gate. Small parties tested the reaction of guards. Larger groups massed when they saw an opportunity to strike a weakly protected detail. Only heavily escorted wagon convoys dared to run the trail south or north. Civilian freighters who had once hoped to profit from the Montana traffic either abandoned the route or accepted work under Army contract, traveling only when soldiers could cover their movement. At night, men on the walls sometimes heard distant singing and drumming from native camps up the valleys, reminders that the fort sat in the middle of someone else's country. Snow began to fall on the surrounding hills in November. The Pinery Road turned slick under wagon wheels, and the cold air cut through wool coats during long hours of guard duty. Inside the walls, fires burned constantly in barrack stoves, sending thin columns of smoke above the stockade. Officers studied maps by lamplight and argued over patrol plans. Carrington worried over ammunition counts and food stocks, knowing that every casualty and every stolen animal narrowed his options. Red Cloud and the other war leaders gathered in their own councils along the Tongue and Powder Rivers now had months of experience watching the fort's habits and weaknesses. The valley of the Piney Creeks held a new, imposing structure of pine logs and packed earth, but the land around it did not belong to the soldiers who lived inside. It belonged to those who could move freely over every ridge and coulee, choosing the time and place for the next hard test. By December 19, 1866, the winter sky over Fort Phil Kearny held a flat, iron-colored light that never seemed to soften. Snow lay in shallow drifts along the inside of the stockade and deeper in the hollows beyond the walls. The ridges around Lodge Trail Ridge and the Pinery Road carried old tracks frozen into hard ruts. Men lived with the memory of Bingham and Bowers lying cut in the snow beyond the ridge. Their deaths had turned that crest into a place every soldier watched with a mix of anger and unease. That morning, the need for firewood still pushed the fort to send wagons out through the gate despite everything that had happened earlier in the month. The wood train formed up again in the yard outside the main entrance. Ox teams were hitched to empty wagons, chains tightened, and tools loaded. Civilian woodcutters checked their axes and saws. Soldiers assigned as escort adjusted belts and examined rifle nipples and cartridges with fingers numbed by cold. Some had patched coats already worn thin at the elbows and shoulders from constant work. The call went out and the train creaked through the gate toward the Pinery. Following the same winding road that everyone knew could carry them straight into another attack. On Pilot Hill, the lookout detail wrapped blankets tight around their shoulders as they scanned the country. The men posted there had watched riders appear and vanish so often that distant movement no longer brought surprise. It brought a tightening in the throat and a quick check of the signal flags. They knew that if the wood train came under fire, their flags and bugle calls were the only warning the fort would have. Below them, the long stockade looked sturdy, but they understood how thin its security really was, while most of the garrison spent its days scattered over miles of open ground. Far from the fort, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho camps along the Tongue and Powder Rivers gathered for winter in sheltered valleys. Teepees stood in circles near timber, smoke from cooking fires hanging in low bands under the cold sky. Since the fight on December 6th, warriors returning from the Piney country had brought detailed accounts of how the soldiers moved, how they responded to decoys, and how they recovered their dead. Around evening fires, men replayed the action on Lodge Trail Ridge, describing how a small group of troopers had been drawn away and destroyed while the main command struggled near the wagons. Those stories fed a growing belief that entire detachments could be cut off and broken if the decoy plan was expanded. Red Cloud listened to these reports with careful attention. Years of fighting the Crow and others had already taught him the value of using terrain and movement instead of charging against fixed positions. He understood that Fort Phil Kearny, with its high log walls and mounted guns, could not easily be stormed. To throw men against the stockade would mean piling bodies under its firing slits for little gain. The open ground around the fort told a different story. Relief forces on horseback and foot strung out between the walls and isolated wagon trains offered better targets. In council, he and other war leaders agreed that the way to strike hard at the soldiers was to destroy their forces in the field, not to batter at their defenses. Evenings in those camps saw long war councils. Warriors who had made their reputations in earlier fights sat beside younger men eager to prove themselves. Cheyenne leaders who had survived the killings at Sand Creek spoke with cold certainty about what to expect from any future dealings with soldiers. Arapaho men who had seen their village burned along the Tongue River laid out their own scars as evidence. The decision taking shape across these different groups carried a single line. The new posts in the Powder River country would either be isolated until the trail withered, or the soldiers protecting that route would be broken outright. Spiritual leaders held ceremonies in lodges lit by firelight and thick with the smell of sage and sweetgrass. Songs rose and fell as men sought guidance and strength. In one council, a respected medicine man stood and told of a vision he had received. In that vision, he said he had seen soldiers riding out of their fort, marching onto a ridge, and falling until 100 white men lay dead. He told the gathered warriors that the enemy would soon be delivered into their hands in a single great fight. The word spread quickly from lodge to lodge. Mothers heard about the prophecy and tightened their children's coats. Warriors heard it and gripped their weapons with renewed purpose. The phrase 100 in the hands became a measure of what they expected to achieve. In these same councils, tactical details were worked out with the precision of men who knew every draw and ridge by memory. The warriors agreed that any attempt to ambush a small detachment, as had been done with Bingham's party, would not be enough. Larger forces had to be brought into a trap. To do that, they would use a strong decoy party, men willing to ride close to the fort and show themselves in apparent disorder, firing into trains and then retreating just fast enough to draw pursuit. Behind the ridge lines, hidden in the folds of ground near Peno Creek and along the slopes beyond Lodge Trail Ridge, the main body of the Allied force would wait. Once the soldiers crossed the crest, disappeared from sight of the stockade, and committed themselves to the chase, the trap would spring. In camp, Crazy Horse prepared for a role that suited his skill. He had proven himself many times as a scout and fighter who could move close to enemy lines without being caught. His calm under fire and his ability to judge distance and timing made him a natural leader for the decoy party. He was not a man who sought public speeches or the center of large gatherings, but when the subject of leading the lure was raised, all knew he was the right choice. Warriors from various bands volunteered to ride with him, men who could stay in the saddle under gunfire and control their ponies over dangerous ground. Closer to Fort Phil Kearny, the men who garrisoned the post lived in a thinner, more strained rhythm. Inside the walls, officers argued quietly over tactics. Some insisted that the fort had to be held as a base, that resources were too limited to risk large offensive movements into hostile ground. Others, hardened by Civil War service, demanded more aggressive patrols, convinced that constant pressure could break the resistance in the surrounding hills. Fetterman kept his place among the most vocal critics of Carrington's caution. He spoke openly about weakness in the present strategy, telling brother officers that experienced troops led properly could drive any force of warriors away from the trail. That morning of December 19th, while the wood train creaked toward the pinery, Carrington carried his own burdens. Reports to his superiors had to explain why attacks persisted despite the presence of a large fort. Casualty lists grew longer with each passing week. He knew his men were scattered thinly between daily labor at the pinery and the hayfields, picket duty on the walls, and the routine of guarding the fort's stores and families. He also knew that without a steady supply of wood, the stockade would freeze in the heart of winter and cooking, heating, and basic survival would become nearly impossible. Every decision to send out a train risked lives, yet every decision to hold a train back endangered the entire command. Near midday, the pattern repeated. From Pilot Hill, the lookout saw riders converging on the wood train. The signal flag came out of its case. Brisk motion spelled the alarm that everyone at the fort recognized at a glance. Down inside the walls, the call sounded to stand to arms. Men dropped tools and rushed for rifles. Officers moved toward the gates, shouting for their assigned companies. Smoke from distant gunfire drifted above the ridges in thin, gray smears. Inside headquarters, Carrington issued orders that reflected both the lesson of December 6th and the pressure from above to act. He selected Captain James Powell to lead a mounted relief toward the wood train. The instructions given to Powell were direct. He was to march to the aid of the wagons, support the escort, and drive back any attackers, but he was not to cross Lodge Trail Ridge under any circumstance. The memory of Bingham's ambush remained fresh. Carrington meant to avoid any repeat of a small detachment being drawn beyond supporting range into unseen ground. Powell accepted the assignment, gathered his men, and prepared to move. Fetterman stood there as the relief was organized and felt the decision cut across his pride. He believed that his own battlefield experience qualified him to take any such command. Friends later recalled that he spoke in strong terms about what he could do. If given the chance to lead a larger force against the warriors outside the fort. His view of the enemy, formed by years of fighting other opponents in the Civil War, did not place the same weight on native tactics that Carrington now did. He saw mobile fighters who could be punished by determined pursuit, not an enemy who must be approached with careful restraint. The choice of Powell, a steady officer who had already shown himself willing to follow restrictive orders in the field, underlined the gap between the two men. Powell's detachment rode out of the gate along the familiar road. As they approached the area near the pinery, they found the wood train under heavy pressure. Wagons had been pulled into a defensive configuration. Teamsters crouched behind wheels, firing from shelter when they had loaded weapons ready. The air carried the sharp reports of rifles and the deeper thud of heavier muskets. Warriors on fast ponies moved in quick passes, sending bullets and arrows toward the corral, then darting back to cover behind low ridges and clumps of brush. Powell took in the scene and obeyed his orders. He placed his men in positions that extended the defensive perimeter without carrying them over the broken ground that led toward Lodge Trail Ridge. Infantry dismounted and formed skirmish lines with their rifle muskets. Cavalrymen, some armed with repeaters, used their horses for mobility but fought mainly on foot, kneeling behind small rises and aiming at the moments when riders exposed themselves during their passes. The combined fire from the escort, the woodcutters, and Powell's reinforcements created zones where any warrior who pushed too close met a storm of bullets. The attackers adjusted and tested the new line repeatedly. They tried rushes from different directions, hoping to find a weak point where a few wagons might be pulled aside and the formation broken. They circled wide, looking for an exposed flank. Each time Powell shifted men to meet the threat, his movements deliberate rather than impulsive. The fight dragged on through the cold afternoon, footprints and hoof marks stamping the snow into churned, bloody slush around the corral. When the firing finally ebbed, both sides had taken losses, but the wagons still stood together, and the relief force remained in good order on the same side of Lodge Trail Ridge where it had begun. From the native perspective, this engagement gave important lessons of its own. Scouts who watched the relief come out of the fort saw that the soldiers could resist the urge to chase decoys across the ridge line when under a cautious commander. They understood that a simple repetition of the pattern that had trapped Bingham would not be enough. More elaborate bait would be needed, a stronger display of apparent weakness and panic, something that officers who scorned caution could not resist. The December 19th fight, though costly, helped refine the plan that had been taking shape in the winter councils. Back inside Fort Phil Kearny that night, the garrison returned to familiar tasks with minds even more taut. Wounded men came in with frozen blood on their coats, supported between comrades who shared their weight. Surgeons worked by lamplight in cramped rooms, cutting away clothing and cleaning wounds while the cold seeped through the walls. Women washed bandages, melted snow for water, and tried not to look at the worst injuries. Dead men were prepared for burial in the hard ground outside the walls, their forms stiff in the winter air as chaplains spoke over them. Each grave dug in frozen soil reminded the living that the country beyond the walls took its price steadily. In the officers' quarters, talk ran late. Some praised Powell for his steady handling of the relief, saying his refusal to be drawn beyond the ridge had saved lives. Others complained that the army would never crush resistance while it remained chained to defensive tactics. Fetterman moved among the latter, his resentment sharpened by the day's events. He had once again watched another officer lead the kind of operation he believed should be his. In conversations after lights out, his insistence that he could clear the country of hostile forces if given freer rein grew only more intense. Those words would sit heavy in the air over the next 2 days. The next day brought no easing of pressure. December 20th arrived with low clouds and the threat of more snow. Work details still had to go out. Wood and hay still had to be gathered. The fort's animals needed fodder and the garrison needed fuel. Every man knew that any trip beyond the gate might meet a sudden assault. At the same time, the constant pattern of raids and reliefs bred a kind of rough familiarity. Men joked darkly about the predictable sequence of signal flag bugle call, saddling up, and riding into the same dangerous ground. Routine wrapped itself around danger, making it easier for some to underestimate the scale of what might come next. Out along the Tongue and Powder, winter camps stayed busy. War leaders counted the men available for the next strike. They reviewed the plan to mass a large, hidden force near Peno Creek while Crazy Horse and his decoy riders harassed the wood train within sight of the fort. The prophecy of 100 in the hands hung over these preparations, not as vague poetry, but as a specific expectation that the next major fight would bring down a force larger than any small detachment. Warriors readied fresh arrows, checked rifle mechanisms, mended bridles, and tied feathers into their horses' manes. Women sewed clothing, repaired moccasins, and laid out dried meat and pemmican so that men could leave camp with supplies ready. By the evening of December 20th, the stage on both sides stood nearly set. At Fort Phil Kearny, the stockade glowed with lamplight and cook fires as men tried to rest in crowded barracks, their ears tuned to any unusual sound from the walls. In the surrounding country, watchfires burned in hidden positions along the planned lines of march, marking places where large numbers of warriors would gather before dawn. The fort's officers reviewed routine orders and thought mainly in terms of another day of escorting wood trains and guarding the walls. They did not know that beyond the ridges, men who had spent years fighting for the Powder River country were ready to stake everything on a single blow that they believed would fulfill a vision of 100 dead soldiers lying in their hands. Dawn on December 6, 1866 came without warmth. Thin ice skinned the water in the ditches around Fort Phil Kearny. and breath from men and animals hung in the air in pale clouds. Frost coated the stockade logs and the roofs of the half-finished barracks. Inside the parade ground, soldiers moved stiffly as they answered roll call, stamping their boots to bring feeling back into their toes. The hills beyond the walls rose in dull gray shapes, the ridgelines dusted with snow that had drifted into hollows during the last storm and then frozen hard. Carrington stood near the center of the parade ground holding a folded sheet of paper that he had already read many times. The order from his superior, General Philip St. George Cooke, told him plainly that he was expected to take the offensive against the warriors who had struck wood trains and wagon columns for months. The letter accused the native fighters of murderous and insulting attacks and demanded decisive action. Carrington felt that demand pressing against everything he knew about his own men, their limited training, and the terrain that wrapped the fort in broken ground. He tucked the paper back into his coat and watched the companies disperse to their daily tasks. Shortly after sunrise, the wood train rolled out of the main gate toward the pinery. Wagons rattled along the frozen road, each pulled by a team of oxen whose hooves struck the ground with hollow thuds. Teamsters hunched on the wagon seats with blankets pulled tight across their shoulders. A small escort of infantry and cavalry rode alongside them, rifles and carbines resting in leather boots on their saddles. The train followed the road northwest, crossing shallow draws and low ridges that rose between the fort and the timber stands near the base of the mountains. The men in the escort had traveled this route many times and knew how often riders appeared on the hills to watch them pass. On the high point known as Pilot Hill, sentries scanned the country through field glasses. The lookout post stood several hundred feet above the fort, giving a clear view over the Pinery Road and the ridges beyond. Near mid-morning, the sentries saw riders arc in toward the wood train from the north. Dust hung in the cold air behind the moving horses. Small flashes marked rifle fire. The wagons began to swing inward as the teamsters tried to form a corral. One of the pickets snapped a signal flag from its case and began to send the alarm toward the fort in a practiced pattern. Down below, the long rectangle of Fort Phil Kearny stirred at once. Carrington received the signal in the headquarters building and stepped outside to confirm it from the wall. Thin smoke from the distant gunfire drifted above the low ridges between the fort and the pinery. He knew the wood train lay roughly 4 miles from the stockade on the far side of broken country where rising and falling ground could hide fast-moving warriors. He also knew that every man and animal lost on that road weakened the fort's grasp on its own survival. Orders from his superior left him no space for inaction. He chose this moment to answer them. In the open ground outside the main gate, Carrington called for 2 mounted forces to assemble. He directed that 50 mounted infantrymen prepare to ride with him along the Pinery Road toward the attacked train. Their task would be to push straight through to the wagons, reinforce the corral, and press the warriors back toward the high ground north of the trail. At the same time, he ordered Captain William Fetterman to take a force of cavalry over the line of hills called Lodge Trail Ridge, approaching from the north to cut off any retreat. The plan was simple on paper. 2 columns would move like closing jaws, pinning the attackers between them near the wood train. Fetterman turned to Lieutenant Horatio Bingham of the 2nd Cavalry and passed the word to form up. The cavalry company had arrived only weeks earlier. Its horses were still thin from the long march, but the men had seen hard fighting in the Civil War and believed that training gave them an edge over any opponent. Their carbines rested in scabbards by their right legs. Some carried 7-shot Spencer repeaters whose lever actions could throw a fast line of fire whenever ammunition was plentiful. Others held older single-shot carbines. Fender straps creaked as the troopers mounted up, their breath floating in front of them as they gathered into fours. Carrington's mounted infantry had a different look. They rode with lighter seats and carried Springfield rifle muskets slung across their backs or balanced at their knees. Those rifles fired a powerful conical bullet with accuracy at long range, but each shot required a lengthy sequence of powder, ball, ramming, and capping. In close, swirling fights, the reloading time could stretch into drawn-out seconds filled with danger. Many of these infantrymen were young recruits who had never seen combat. They shifted uneasily in their saddles as they waited for the signal to move. When the gate swung open, Carrington led his mounted infantry straight out along the Pinery Road. Fetterman and Bingham wheeled their cavalry to the left toward the low, snow-patched mass of Lodge Trail Ridge. The two commands separated quickly as they crossed the frozen ground, one following the wagon track, the other climbing toward higher terrain. From the fort walls, observers saw the blue-coated riders divide and then vanish in different directions, the sound of hooves fading under the steady crack of distant guns near the wood train. Along the Pinery Road, Carrington pressed his men into a trot. The trail dipped into shallow draws where the riders lost sight of the fort, then climbed again toward open slopes. The cold air cut at their lungs. Horses labored, their shoes clicking against hidden rocks just beneath the frost-hardened soil. As the column gained ground, rifle shots grew louder and more distinct. Carrington could hear the deeper boom of Springfield muskets from the wagons and the sharper reports of lighter weapons from riders in motion. A low band of smoke marked the fighting ahead. On the route across Lodge Trail Ridge, the cavalry moved over more broken country. Snow lay in drifts among scattered rocks and sage. The ridge rose in a broad back that blocked line of sight from the fort. Once the troopers crossed that rise, no one behind the stockade would be able to see what happened next. Fetterman and Bingham pushed their men forward, knowing that speed was important if they wanted to reach the north side of the wood train before the warriors pulled away. Horses staggered in the drifts and then steadied as riders urged them on. Near the crest, small groups of Lakota and Cheyenne riders appeared, trotting easily along the skyline. They fired occasional shots and shouted insults down the slope. A few dismounted and waved blankets or coats, turning and then trotting away in short bursts as if they were nervous and unsure. Others paused long enough to draw the attention of the soldiers, then dropped over the far side of the ridge. They showed themselves just long enough to be seen, then seemed to break and run. That pattern followed the same form that warriors had used for months to draw small parties of soldiers into exposed positions. Bingham saw one of these groups closing in on the left of his line and kicked his horse forward. Sergeant Amos Bowers followed with a handful of troopers. Their mounts picked up speed as they chased the riders along a shallow saddle that led away from the main body of the cavalry. The troopers believed they saw a chance to cut down an isolated cluster of enemies before the rest could join them. Snow and frozen dust flew under their horses' hooves as they drove toward the apparently retreating figures. The decoy group ahead did not flee blindly. They kept just beyond the reach of the troopers' carbines, turning in their saddles to fire back and then racing on whenever the gap narrowed. Their ponies handled the broken ground with ease born of long use. They led Bingham's party along a narrow draw that curved away from the main ridge and into a small basin edged with rock and brush. Once the soldiers had dropped into that low ground, higher slopes rose on three sides, cutting off any clear view back toward the rest of the command. At a signal unseen by the troopers, warriors hidden along the sides of the draw mounted and closed in. Riders appeared suddenly on both flanks, moving in from behind rock outcrops and from stands of low juniper. Arrows and bullets poured into the small knot of cavalrymen from close range. Horses screamed and went down. Men tried to wheel around, but their mounts collided in the confined space. Bingham Spencer came up and he fired into the nearest rider, knocking man and horse into the dirt. But there were many more behind. Within moments, the troopers fought for their lives at arm's length. Some tried to reload their carbines while using their horses as cover, fingers clumsy from cold and shock. Warriors slid in with lances and war clubs, striking at heads and shoulders. Bowers fired his last cartridge and then swung his carbine as a club. He disappeared under a crowd of riders. Bingham took multiple wounds, falling from his saddle into the frozen dust. When the warriors pulled back, their ponies stepping around the bodies, Bingham and Bowers lay motionless among several dead cavalry horses. The decoy riders circled once more and then galloped toward the main battle near the road, leaving the destroyed detachment behind in the snow. While that small fight unfolded beyond the ridge, the wood train near the pinery fought to stay intact. The teamsters had managed to pull their wagons into a rough rectangle, chaining wheels and bracing tongues against one another. Oxen lay inside the corral, some standing pressed against the beds, others down with legs folded under them. Woodcutters who had been working in the nearby timber sprinted for the wagons, carrying their axes as weapons. Soldiers in the escort spread along the corners of the corral, resting rifle barrels on the wagon sides and firing at riders who raced in, loosed arrows and then wheeled away. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors used the contours of the ground, slipping into shallow folds in the earth and then bursting forward in short rushes. Arrows rattled against the wagon beds. Bullets whined past the heads of men trying to reload. A few oxen broke and tried to run, only to be cut down and left in the open as obstacles. The defenders knew that if the corral broke, the train would turn into a scattered line of overturned wagons and dead animals, easy pickings for anyone still on a horse. Every few minutes, teamsters shouted to shift positions, hauling at wheels to close gaps and dragging wounded men inward. Carrington's mounted infantry reached the outer edge of the fight with rifles already loaded. He deployed his men on foot, forming a skirmish line that extended from the line of wagons into the rough ground on one flank. Rifle muskets spoke in measured volleys, the heavy bullets reaching farther than many of the warriors' older smoothbores. Each shot meant a pause while clouds of powder smoke hung in the still winter air and men rammed new charges down their barrels. The infantry's slow but steady fire gave the embattled train breathing room. Warriors who had been riding close to the corral shifted their attention to the new threat, cutting in toward the troops with rapid mounted attacks that tested the line and then darted away. Fetterman, now without Bingham's full company at his side, brought the remainder of the cavalry force down from Lodge Trail Ridge toward the same fight. His path carried him across the line where the decoy riders had drawn Bingham away. Scattered traces on the snow and distant shouts made it clear that something violent had happened beyond his immediate view, but he had no time to halt and search. He led his men down toward the sound of the main firefight, intending to catch the warriors between his horsemen and Carrington's infantry. As the cavalry closed in, the weight of fire around the wood train shifted. Warriors saw their path of withdrawal narrowing and chose to pull back rather than be pinned in a close-range crossfire. They wheeled their ponies and rode for the cover of distant ridges, driving loose stock ahead of them when they could. Some circled at a greater distance, continuing to fire in order to cover the retreat. Others vanished into folds of ground so quickly that it seemed as if the hills themselves had swallowed them. The sharp crack of carbines and muskets faded, replaced by scattered single shots and the groans of wounded men and animals. Once the area around the wood train grew quiet, Carrington and Fetterman gathered their officers and took stock. Several soldiers and civilians lay dead or badly hurt. Wagon beds showed fresh scars where bullets and arrows had torn into them. A number of oxen lay down and did not rise again, leaving gaps in the teams that would make hauling more wood difficult in the days ahead. The train had survived and the escort had driven off the attack, but there was no sense of triumph in the air. Both commanders knew that this fight had been close, and that the attackers had managed to cut part of the cavalry away and destroy it outright. Later that day, search parties followed the tracks back toward Lodge Trail Ridge. There, in a shallow draw, partly hidden by rock and brush, they found the bodies of Bingham and Bowers, along with the carcasses of several cavalry horses. Bingham's body bore many arrow wounds. His uniform was torn and stiff with frozen blood. The exact count of shafts found in him varied in later recollections, but the men who lifted him from the ground never forgot the sight. Bowers lay nearby, battered and pierced. The bodies showed signs of mutilation that reflected the warriors' practice of taking revenge and honors from fallen enemies, cutting and piercing in ways that spoke to them of power. For the soldiers who recovered their comrades, the marks only added fury and dread. The remains were brought back to the fort and laid out so that their units could identify them. In the cold light of late afternoon, men filed past and looked down at the faces of Bingham and Bowers. Some had served with them on other postings. Others had known them only as firm voices on the drill field. Now they saw the cost of a moment's separation from the main body and of a chase into ground chosen by their opponents. The sight carved a deep impression into the memory of the garrison. That night, candles burned in the quarters of the 2nd Cavalry while officers spoke in low tones about what had happened beyond the ridge. Inside headquarters, Carrington wrote his report of the fight, listing the dead and wounded and the estimated number of enemies killed. He noted that a small party had pursued decoys into an ambush and paid for that decision with their lives. The experience hardened his belief that his men needed stricter discipline in the field and greater caution whenever mounted warriors seemed eager to draw them out. He ordered more intensive drills, breaking his command into smaller tactical units and rehearsing them in forming skirmish lines, defending wagon corrals and falling back in good order. The stockade remained his main security, but he now understood even more clearly that his soldiers would often have to fight in scattered patches of rough ground far from the fort walls. In the officers' quarters, Fetterman saw the same events through a different lens. To him, the fight on December 6th showed that bold action could drive the enemy away when troops pushed hard enough. He resented the fact that his command had been split, leaving Bingham exposed while the rest of the cavalry fought near the wood train. He believed that a larger, more aggressive movement over Lodge Trail Ridge could have cut off and destroyed every warrior involved in the attack. He voiced those views openly in conversations with fellow officers, joining other critics who already thought Carrington's strategy too defensive for the situation. Beyond the ridges in Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho camps, word of the day's fighting spread in a different tone. Warriors told how decoys had drawn mounted soldiers away from the main body and into a pocket where hidden fighters could close in from 3 sides. They spoke of the confusion among the troopers when arrows and bullets came from angles they had not expected. They described the impact of arrows striking cavalry horses and the way the line broke when mounts went down in tight ground. For them, the destruction of Bingham's party on the far side of the ridge stood as clear proof that the soldiers could be separated and cut down in detail if lured into the right terrain. The battle on December 6th left Fort Phil Kearny standing and the wood train still rolling, but it also etched Lodge Trail Ridge into the minds of everyone involved. For the soldiers, it was a place where a path over the hills could lead straight into a pocket of death. For Red Cloud and the other war leaders, it was a piece of high ground that could hide a far larger plan. The first blood spilled there traced a pattern that would soon be repeated on a greater scale, when a stronger decoy force and a massed body of warriors waited beyond the crest for a larger command to follow the same fatal line. Before daylight on December 21, 1866, Fort Phil Kearny sat under a hard, still cold that reached into every gap between the logs. Frost grew thick on the inside of window panes in officers' quarters, and men on guard stamped their feet on the firing platforms along the stockade, watching their breath drift upward into the dark. The sky held a faint gray band along the eastern horizon over the rolling country toward the Powder River. Inside the walls, only the sound of an occasional cough, the creak of a door or a muffled order broke the quiet. In his headquarters room, Carrington sat at a rough plank table with a single lamp burning low. Beside it lay a stack of reports, a map of the country between Fort Phil Kearny and Fort Reno, and the worn copy of General Cook's letter that demanded firmer action against the hostile forces in the surrounding hills. Outside the thin wall, bootsteps thudded along the frozen parade ground as the sergeant of the guard changed the relief at the main gate. Carrington heard the challenge, the reply, and the clatter of a musket butt on the wooden floor of the guardhouse. He rubbed his tired eyes and looked again at the schedule laid out for the day. Wood and hay had to be brought in. Animals had to be fed. Men had to stand watch. There was no space in the ledger for rest. In the enlisted barracks, men began to stir while it was still dark. Company first sergeants moved down the rows of bunks, shaking shoulders and calling names. Blankets were thrown back. Boots were pulled on stiff feet that had gone to sleep inside wool socks that had seen too many days of use. Tin cups clinked on rough tables as small fires were coaxed to life in the stoves. Coffee boiled in blackened pots, sending a sharp smell through the crowded rooms. Some men pulled greatcoats tight around them even indoors, knowing that the moment they stepped onto the parade ground, the cold would cut straight through their shirts. Outside the walls, in camps strung along sheltered parts of the Tongue and Powder River valleys, fires had burned all night while war parties prepared. Warriors had spent hours painting faces and bodies with symbols that held meaning for them, tying fresh thongs on bows, checking the actions of their rifles and fitting new rawhide into bridles and saddle ropes. Horses stood ready, already watered and fed with dried grass and brush taken from the frozen ground. Scouts who had watched the fort in previous days brought in their final reports, describing where the wood trains traveled, how many men guarded them, and how quickly reinforcements came when signals went up from the lookout hill. Before dawn, the first groups of mounted warriors moved out of those camps. They rode in loose clusters, keeping to low ground and timber where possible, avoiding any sightline that might expose their numbers too soon. The ponies moved easily over the snow crust, hooves breaking through in a steady rhythm. Men carried extra ammunition in bags at their belts and slung across their shoulders. Some had new rifles or carbines taken in earlier fights. Others held older trade guns and carefully guarded powder. Bowstrings had been checked and rechecked. Quivers rattled softly with arrows as the riders moved toward the country overlooking Fort Phil Kearny and the roads that ran north and west from its gate. Inside the fort, the first clear signal that the day would follow the usual pattern came with the call to form the wood train. Long before the sun cleared the ridges, teamsters began harnessing oxen in the yards near the corral. Yokes came down on bowed necks. Iron chains were hooked through rings and links tested by hand. The wagons chosen for the trip stood in a rough line, their beds empty except for chains, tools, and a few blankets rolled near the front. Civilian woodcutters, men used to axes and saws rather than rifles, checked the edges of their tools and pulled on heavy mittens that would still not keep all the cold from their hands. When the bugle sounded assembly for the escort detail, soldiers moved into formation with a mix of resignation and determination. Men assigned to guard the train knew the road and knew the risk. Some had walked alongside those wagons through rifle fire before. Others were fresh to the fort, but not to danger, having served in campaigns elsewhere. They buckled cartridge boxes, slung haversacks, and checked that their rifle or carbine sights were free of frost. Cavalry troopers tightened girths and checked curb chains on the bits of their horses. Infantrymen looked toward the hills beyond the fort and measured the distance in their minds, knowing that if anything serious happened on that road, their lives would depend on how quickly help could reach them. As the eastern sky lightened, the main gate creaked open. The wood train rolled out, oxen blowing steam into the air with each breath, hooves striking the frozen ground with a dull, steady beat. The escort moved with them, keeping pace on either side, watching the ridges. Behind them, the walls of the fort loomed, dark against the pale sky. Ahead lay the broken ground that separated the post from the pinery, the same ground that had already swallowed small parties of soldiers and seen wagons turned into rough fortresses under fire. On Pilot Hill, the lookout detail now saw more than the familiar shape of the fort and the roads. As the light strengthened, distant points of movement appeared to the north and west. Riders showed themselves briefly on ridges and then dropped out of sight. Thin streams of vapor drifted above sheltered draws where horses and men moved in numbers hidden from the fort below. The soldiers on the hill knew the difference between a few scouts and the indications of a larger force. They reported what they saw and kept their eyes fixed on the wood train, which had become a small moving line against the white and brown of the winter landscape. Back in headquarters, Carrington worked through the morning routine. He checked the disposition of each company, read the report from the night's patrols, and made note of ammunition counts. The memory of earlier attacks lay behind every decision. He knew that the wood train could not be left without support if a serious assault developed. He also knew that his garrison could not afford to throw away men in reckless charges beyond the ridge. The instructions he had given after December 6th and again after December 19th were clear. Any relief force was to protect the wagons but not to cross Lodge Trail Ridge. The ridgeline that hid ground from the fort's eyes remained a strict boundary in his mind. At the same time, relations among his officers had grown strained. In the weeks since arriving, Fetterman had repeatedly expressed strong doubts about the restraint Carrington imposed on operations beyond the fort. He had claimed in conversation that with his Civil War experience, he could march a small number of men through the entire Sioux Nation. He had told others that the native fighters surrounding the fort could be defeated if only more aggressive tactics were used. These statements had reached Carrington's ears. They added a layer of tension to each decision about who would command which detail. Around mid-morning, the lookout on Pilot Hill suddenly saw the wood train change shape. Wagons began to draw together. Dust and smoke rose in a confused cloud near their position. Small, dark figures on horseback swept in from the north, some circling tight around the train's location, others riding back and forth in a way that made counting them difficult. The lookout reached for the signal flag and began to send the prearranged alert toward the fort. Inside the walls, the flag on the tall staff shifted as another sign that trouble had started along the Pinery Road. The alarm moved quickly through Fort Phil Kearny. Drummers and buglers took their places and sounded the calls that brought men to arms. In barracks and workshops, tools dropped to the ground. Men ran for weapons racks, reaching for rifle muskets and cartridge boxes. Horses in the corral tossed their heads and stamped as troopers rushed to saddle them. The main gate area became a tight space filled with men, animals, and shouted orders. Officers pushed through the chaos to find their assigned places. Sergeant majors and first sergeants tried to keep counts straight while the cold air filled with the noise of preparation. Carrington stepped out onto the parade ground and looked toward the hills. Even from inside the fort, he could see the faint smear of smoke that marked the wood train, and nearer to it, the flicker of movement around the wagons. He knew the pattern. The train had been attacked, the escort was fighting, and the distance was such that the men out there would not hold indefinitely without help. He called for a relief force to be assembled, choosing infantrymen and cavalry whose animals were in condition to move fast in the cold. The relief would have to be strong enough to break through and to discourage any attempt to cut it up in detail. At that moment, Carrington named Captain James Powell to command the relief, consistent with his practice in recent weeks. Powell had already shown that he would follow orders precisely, and Carrington intended to reinforce the wood train without risking another disaster beyond the ridge. As the orders were given, Fetterman arrived in the area near the gate, having been alerted by the bugle calls. He heard that a relief was forming and that Powell stood appointed to lead it. Here, the tangled question of rank and authority on the frontier came into play. Fetterman held a brevet rank of lieutenant colonel from his Civil War service, a temporary promotion earned in earlier campaigns. In regular standing within the 18th Infantry, he was a captain, just like Powell. On this day, he used his brevet status. By claiming higher rank, he asserted command of the relief force and took over the detail that Carrington had intended for Powell. Accounts from men present later described that moment in different tones, but all agreed that Fetterman stepped into the role with clear confidence, telling Carrington that he would handle the situation. Carrington repeated his conditions. The relief was to go straight to the wood train, drive off the attackers, and return. Under no circumstance was the force to cross Lodge Trail Ridge or pursue any enemy beyond sight of the fort. The ridge had already proved to be a place where men could vanish into country filled with hidden fighters. Fetterman voiced agreement. Men nearby heard him answer that he understood the orders. There was no ambiguity in the instruction that the relief was to remain on the near side of the ridge. Lieutenant George Grummond, commanding the cavalry attachment, readied his mounted men to accompany Fetterman. Grummond was known as an energetic and daring officer, quick to act and sure of his own judgment in the field. Alongside the regular troopers came two civilian volunteers, James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher, hunters and frontiersmen who carried 16-shot Henry repeating rifles. These weapons could deliver a stream of fire unmatched by any standard Army firearm at the fort, and their owners took pride in their skill with them. Among the infantry assigned to the relief were men from Company C and Company H of the 18th Infantry, drawn up and ready to march at a quick step once the mounted component left the gate. As the detail formed fully, the numbers came clear. Fetterman's command would include 49 infantrymen on foot, around 30 cavalry troopers on horseback, including Grummond's men, the two armed civilians with their repeating rifles, and a single teenage bugler whose job was to carry orders through sound rather than shouted words. In total, 81 men gathered for the relief. They carried the mix of weapons found throughout the fort, from single-shot rifle muskets and carbines to the few repeaters in civilian hands. The men checked caps, cartridges, and straps while officers made final inspections. On the other side of the stockade, the wood train continued its struggle. The wagons had been pulled together as best as space allowed. Drivers and woodcutters fired from behind wheels and under wagon beds. Some oxen already lay dead or wounded, their bodies forming obstacles as much as cover. Warriors on fast ponies moved in quick runs toward the corral, sending in fire, then pulling back before defenders could fix on them. They made use of shallow depressions, brush clumps, and low rises to shield themselves between rushes. The escort held, but every minute under such pressure increased the risk that ammunition would run low or that a gap in the wagons would open. Across the valley and along the slopes leading to Lodge Trail Ridge, Crazy Horse and the decoy riders moved into their positions. They kept their numbers small near the fort, making sure that only a limited group would be visible from the walls and from the wood train. Behind the crest of the ridge, hidden from the fort's eyes, larger numbers of warriors waited on their ponies, watching for the moment when the soldiers would commit themselves beyond the line that had already proved so dangerous. The ground that fell away from the top of the ridge toward Peno Creek held folds, ravines, and low rises that could hide considerable bodies of men until the instant of attack. Warriors studied those shapes, knowing which hollows they would use to gather speed before rushing in. Back within the stockade, Carrington watched the final preparations from the headquarters side and repeated his instructions yet again. There would be no crossing of Lodge Trail Ridge. The relief would go only as far as needed to secure the wood train. Any attempt by hostile riders to lure the command beyond the crest was to be ignored. The matter was not presented as a suggestion, but as a direct order. Men standing nearby understood that these words were meant not only for the officers in immediate charge, but also for any man who might feel a surge of personal desire to drive the enemy farther. When the bugle finally blew the signal to advance, the gate swung wide. Cavalry horses surged forward first, hooves biting into the frozen earth as the riders settled into their saddles. Behind them stepped the infantry, rifles at the right shoulder or held across the body, breath steaming in unison as they moved at a pace meant to balance speed with the need to keep formation. Wheatley and Fisher fell in with the horsemen, their Henry rifles carried ready in gloved hands. The bugler trotted near the front, horn hanging at his side for the moment. Men on the walls watched the column move out and counted the files. They noted familiar faces, friends from mess tables and work details, and followed them with their eyes until the relief passed beyond the first low swell of ground. Inside the stockade, the noise of the departing column faded, replaced once more by the creak of the gate as it settled, partly closed, and the muffled sounds of life continuing in cramped barracks and small houses. Outside, the 81 men under Fetterman moved toward a landscape that had already taken many lives and that now held far more riders than anyone inside the fort could see from where they stood. December 21st, 1866, late morning. The column under Fetterman moved north from Fort Phil Kearny with the wood train on its right and the low roll of Lodge Trail Ridge ahead. Cavalry horses broke a narrow path through the frost-hardened ground. Infantrymen followed at a marching pace, boots crunching into the old snow crust. Breath from men and animals drifted behind them as a pale trail that marked their progress from the gate into country that had already taken many lives. The sounds of the fort diminished with every step. Hammer blows from carpenters, shouts from teamsters, and the faint music of the regimental band faded until only the jingle of harness, the creak of leather, and the clatter of canteens against bayonets remained. For the first stretch, the column followed the same track that led toward the pinery. The road wound through shallow depressions and up gentle rises, skirting patches of brush and scattered rocks. On the right, toward the west, distant timber marked the place where the woodcutters worked. On the left, toward the northeast, the land rose in the long back of Lodge Trail Ridge, a snow-streaked barrier between the fort and the open country beyond. Fetterman rode near the front of the infantry, his greatcoat buttoned tight, eyes on the ground ahead. Drummond and the cavalry stayed slightly forward and to one side, ready to swing either toward the train or toward the ridge as orders required. The air carried faint echoes of gunfire from the direction of the wood train. Individual reports blended into a scattered rumble. Every man in the relief force understood that those shots meant the escort and the teamsters were still fighting. The distance between the fort and the wagons now lay under the relief's feet and hooves. If they moved too slowly, the train might be overrun and destroyed before they arrived. If they rushed blindly, they risked repeating the fate of Bingham and Bowers beyond the ridge. That balance between speed and caution set the rhythm of the advance. After some minutes on the Pinery Road, the column reached a point where a branching track rose toward Lodge Trail Ridge. From this point, turning left would lead over the crest and into the valley that lay out of sight from the fort. Continuing straight would take the relief directly toward the wood train, following the route that Carrington had expected them to use. Fetterman chose the left turn. His command pivoted toward the ridge, cavalry angling up the slope first, infantry shifting to follow. The decision carried the relief away from the direct line to the wagons and onto the same path that had already seen one small detachment cut off and destroyed. Observers on Pilot Hill watched the column make this turn. From their height, they could see the small figures in blue leave the Pinery Road and begin to climb the long spine of Lodge Trail Ridge. They could not hear any words exchanged between officers below, only the change in direction and the different angle of the line. Signals from the lookout post went down toward the fort, reporting the movement. Inside the stockade, men who understood the terrain knew instantly that the relief was heading toward ground. where the fort's guns and eyes could not reach them. As the cavalry climbed, Lakota and Cheyenne riders appeared again along the crest. They rode at an easy pace, just far enough away to avoid effective rifle fire from below. Some waved blankets or lances, making broad gestures toward the north as if to challenge the soldiers to follow. Others dismounted and walked their horses a few steps before mounting again, giving the impression of men unsure or disordered. Every action was measured to invite pursuit. The riders never closed completely, but they never disappeared entirely. Grumman's troopers felt their horses gather under them as the grade steepened. Snow lay deeper on the upper slopes, drifted by wind into uneven patches that hid rocks and dips. The animals labored, flanks heaving, breath turning into quick bursts of vapor. Men leaned forward in their saddles, carbines slung at their sides. The bugler Metzger rode near the officers, his instrument hanging from a strap across his chest, gloved hand steady on the reins. Behind the horsemen, the infantry line shortened its intervals to keep cohesion on the incline. Men tightened grips on rifle stocks and forced their legs to maintain the pace. At one point near the shoulder of the ridge, the column passed ground that men knew lay not far from where Bingham and Bowers had fallen 2 weeks earlier. No markers stood on that frozen slope, but the memory of the ambush hovered there just the same. Some of the infantry who had helped recover the bodies on December 6th now marched past the general area with the same rifles and equipment they had carried that day. The hill, the snow, and the broken draws around them gave a clear reminder that the enemy understood this terrain in ways the soldiers did not. From the crest, the view stretched in every direction. To the south, the stockade of Fort Phil Kearny sat as a dark rectangle against the lighter ground, smoke from its chimneys rising straight up in the still air. The Pinery Road and the wood train lay to the west, reduced by distance to small shapes. To the north and east, the land dropped away in folds and gullies toward Peno Creek and the open country beyond. Scattered timber clung to the sides of draws. Low ridges cast sharp-edged shadows on the snow. In that broken landscape, numbers could vanish. As the column reached the high ground, the decoy riders shifted their performance. They came closer in brief rushes, firing from horseback and then wheeling away, leaving fresh tracks in the snow that led down the far slope. Their shouts carried on the cold air, sharp cries that cut through the usual silence of the ridge. From below, their movements might have looked unplanned, like the erratic motion of men, unsure of themselves. In fact, each pass had a purpose. They showed just enough vulnerability to convince any aggressive commander that a determined push could reach and scatter them. Grumman urged the cavalry forward. His troopers broke into a faster gait, closing some of the distance with the retreating riders. Snow flew from under the hooves as horses pounded along the ridge line. The line of mounted men stretched as faster animals and more forceful riders moved ahead. Some troopers, hearing the crack of rifles and seeing figures drawing away from them, spurred their mounts harder, eager to reach contact. The neat formation that had left the fort began to lengthen and loosen under the pressure of the chase. Behind them, the infantry struggled to keep up. Men in heavy coats and full equipment climbed over drifts and around rocks, feet slipping on patches of ice hidden under the snow. Their breathing became harsh and ragged. The distance between the rear files of the cavalry and the front rank of the foot soldiers grew with every minute. Fetterman, riding with the main body of infantry officers, saw the gap forming and pushed his men as hard as he could without breaking the column completely. The relief was no longer a compact force. It was a stretched line, with the fastest riders far ahead and the footmen still on the higher ground of the ridge. The last soldiers in the fort who could see the column watched them reach the true crest of Lodge Trail Ridge and begin to drop out of sight on the far side. From that vantage, the cavalry disappeared first, their dark figures slipping beyond the line where earth and sky met. A few moments later, the upper parts of the infantry's heads and shoulders vanished as well, leaving only flashes of movement near the skyline. Then those too were gone. From the fort and from Pilot Hill there remained only empty ridge and distant hills with no blue coats in view. On the far slope, the decoy riders led the cavalry down into a broad swale that ran toward Peno Creek. The ground there dipped and rose in gentle waves, enough to hide men lying prone or mounted in hollows. Snow clung to the shaded sides of the draws, while south-facing slopes showed more exposed earth and dried grass. From the bottom of the swale, the fort was no longer visible at all. The relief force now moved in a landscape that hid them from all friendly eyes. Every decision they made from this point forward would be carried out with no direct support from the walls they had left behind. As the riders followed the decoys into this low ground, shapes began to appear along the flanks that had not been visible from the ridge. Single mounted figures watched from small rises, then turned and disappeared as soon as the soldiers looked their way. The number of hoof tracks in the snow increased, crisscrossing the path ahead and along both sides. Occasionally, a gunshot rang out from a distance, more as a prod than as a serious attempt to hit anyone. The cavalry pressed on, focusing on the fleeing figures directly in front of them and on the thought of closing with an enemy they had chased since leaving the fort. The infantry came over the crest behind them and felt the same shift. For a short time, the slope hid them from any view back toward Fort Phil Kearny. All they saw was the line of retreating cavalry ahead, and beyond that, the dipping country of the swale. Their boots punched into the softer snow on the downward grade, and gravity pulled them into a faster pace than the climb had allowed. Rifles bounced against shoulders and backs. Cartridge boxes thumped against hips. The need to keep sight of the mounted men ahead drove them as much as any shouted order. Somewhere down the line, Wheatley and Fisher adjusted their seats in the saddle to keep their balance as the horses descended. Their Henry rifles rested across their laps, loaded magazines ready at hand. The two civilians had agreed to ride with the cavalry because their repeating weapons could deliver concentrated fire if the enemy closed to within effective range. They watched the flanks as much as the front, aware from long experience that attacks could come from any direction in broken country. Behind and beyond the visible enemy, the main body of warriors held position in concealed pockets of ground. Men sat their ponies in ravines and behind low ridges, weapons ready, listening for the pattern of gunfire and shouted signals that would tell them when to move. The decoy party's appearance and the soldiers' pursuit had already confirmed that the plan to draw a larger force over the ridge was working. What remained was to time the moment when the hidden lines would surge forward and close the space around the stretched column. At Fort Phil Kearny, the first sign that the relief had crossed into serious contact came through sound rather than sight. Men on the walls heard a change in the pattern of gunfire far to the north and east. The random popping of scattered shots gave way to more sustained firing, a steady cracking that carried faintly through the cold air. The distance made it impossible to tell how many weapons were involved, but the continuous nature of the reports told an unmistakable story. The 81 men who had left through the gate that morning were now fully engaged beyond the ridge, in a place where no one inside the stockade could see them or reach them in time. Inside the fort, officers stepped to the walls and listened, counting the intervals between volleys and single shots. Some thought of the clear, strict order that had been given not to cross Lodge Trail Ridge and realized that the sound of battle on the far side meant that order had been broken. Others focused only on the fact that comrades were in danger, wondering if there remained any way to send further help without stripping the stockade of its defense. Carrington weighed those questions in his mind as he paced the headquarters yard, knowing that the garrison could not afford to lose more men. Yet hearing in the distant firing the proof that a large engagement had already begun. On Lodge Trail Ridge itself, The ground held only the fresh prints of hoofs and boots leading away from the fort. Above it, the winter sky remained clear. The ridgeline drew a hard, clean arc across the landscape, marking the boundary between what the garrison could witness and what now unfolded out of sight. Beyond that line, in a tangle of ravines and low ridges near Peno Creek, the relief column under Fetterman, Drummond, and Brown moved deeper into a space that had been chosen and prepared by the men they had come out to fight. The full weight of that choice had not yet fallen on them, but every step down the far slope brought them closer to the point where the hidden lines of warriors would break from cover and the valley would close. The sound of gunfire beyond Lodge Trail Ridge did not end suddenly. It thinned. What had been a hard, steady crackle faded into scattered reports, then into a few single shots spaced by long silences. Men on the walls of Fort Phil Kearny listened with every muscle tight, knowing that each gap meant fewer rifles still in use. Then, for a time that felt longer than it was, there was nothing. The winter air over the ridge went quiet. Smoke that had hung in a faint band above the distant ground drifted apart and vanished. No one inside the stockade could see what had happened to the relief column. Every man who knew the country understood what silence in that direction might mean. Carrington faced a choice he had hoped never to confront. Fetterman's 81 men had gone beyond the line of sight with orders not to cross the ridge. The sound of battle on the far side proved that those orders had been broken in the field. If Carrington stripped the fort to send out another force, he might expose the women, children, and wounded inside to an attack by the same warriors who had just swallowed the relief. If he did nothing, he left those men entirely to their fate. He needed information. To get it, he called for Captain Tenador Ten Ike. Ten Ike, a solid officer who had already shown caution and reliability at the fort, reported to headquarters quickly. Carrington ordered him to take a detachment north with wagons and ambulances, climb Lodge Trail Ridge, and determine what had happened. Ten Ike's task was to recover survivors if any could be found, and to bring back the wounded and dead if the situation allowed. He was warned not to throw his men into a battle already lost. The fort could not afford to see a second relief consumed by the same trap. The detachment assembled with clinical speed. Infantrymen pulled on greatcoats, checked their rifle muskets, and moved into column. Teamsters hitched mules to ambulances and wagons fitted to carry men rather than supplies. Surgeons and hospital attendants gathered medical bags, bandages, and bottles of what medicines the post held. The number of men Ten Ike could take had to be balanced against the minimum needed to hold the fort. The detail that marched out was large enough to protect the wagons under normal conditions, but hardly a match for the force that had just pulled Fetterman's command into the basin beyond Peno Creek. When the gate opened once more, the detachment stepped into cold air and pale afternoon light. Snow underfoot had begun to soften slightly where the thin sun touched it, making the surface slick. Ten Ike rode at the head of the column, his face set. Ahead, the back of Lodge Trail Ridge rose in a long arc, snow-streaked and quiet. Behind him, the stockade shrank with each step, its walls closing slowly until they looked like nothing more than a dark band around a cluster of roofs and chimneys. The climb toward the ridge followed the same rising ground the cavalry had taken earlier in the day. Men in the detachment saw tracks where horses and boots had cut deep into the snow crust. In some places, the marks overlapped so heavily that the original paths blurred into churned, frozen ruts. The slope grew steeper and the air thinner. Breath came in white gusts from the mouths of men and mules. Hooves slipped and caught again. Boots scraped on hidden rock. No enemy riders appeared on the skyline. The silence that had begun after the last scattered shots now pressed against the ears of every man in the column. When Ten Ike reached the crest of Lodge Trail Ridge, he halted and looked down. The basin beyond opened in a wide curve etched in white and brown. Broken ridges and shallow gullies cut across it. Smoke from many small fires drifted across the low ground. Far below, mounted warriors still moved, their horses dark specks against the snow. Groups of men walked among scattered forms on the basin floor. From his position on the ridge, Tenike saw that the valley was still thick with hostile fighters. The number could not be counted precisely, but the mass of movement made the scale plain. Any attempt by his small detachment to charge down into that swarm would end in the same way the first relief had ended. Tenike brought his men into a defensive posture along the crest. Infantry formed a line just below the skyline where they could lie prone with rifles pointed downslope. Wagons and ambulances were pulled into partial cover behind the slope, where their teams were less exposed to long-range fire. The captain knew that if the warriors in the basin saw his group as a threat, they might race up the slope and try to push the new force off the ridge. A blow like that would leave the fort almost empty of effective defenders. He issued strict orders. No man was to fire or advance without command. The detachment would hold the high ground and watch. Below, some warriors noticed the new figures along the ridge. A few mounted men rode partway up the slope to look more closely. Shots were exchanged at long distance, bullets kicking up small puffs of snow between the two sides. The distance and the angle made any serious hit unlikely. After testing the reaction of Tenike's line, the riders turned back toward the basin. The main task facing the native force by that point had changed from killing the relief to recovering their own wounded and dead and stripping the field of anything useful. From his vantage point, Tenike watched the work continuing below. He saw lines of men leading ponies among the fallen. He saw blankets and saddlecloths spread and then lifted again as bodies were placed on travois or across horsebacks. He saw bright glints where steel caught the low sun. The men in his detachment understood that those glints often came from knives and hatchets at work on the bodies of their comrades. Rage rose along the ridge, but the captain held his men in place. To plunge down now would be to throw away the only force left that could still move with some strength outside the stockade. The hours of the short winter afternoon ran off while the scene below changed in gradual stages. At first the basin teemed with warriors and horses. Then the movement began to thin as groups finished their tasks and rode away toward the north and west. The smoke that had lain close to the ground lifted as fires were stamped out. Gradually, the number of mounted men in the valley dropped. From the ridge, those watching could see clusters of horsemen heading off in long files following paths that led toward the Tongue River country. Tenike waited until the basin held only a few distant riders. When it appeared that the main body of attackers had withdrawn, he ordered a cautious advance down the slope. Infantry went first, moving in a loose line that allowed each man to see and support his neighbors. Rifles were kept at the ready. The wagons followed at a slower pace. Mules strained against traces in the slick snow. Every eye scanned the folds of ground for any sign that warriors might still be lying in wait. As the detachment reached the basin floor, the sight before them answered the question that had haunted the fort since the firing stopped. Bodies lay scattered along the route the relief had taken, in gullies, on low rises, and along the line of the ridge where Fetterman and Brown had formed their last stands. Horses lay where they had fallen, some on their sides with legs rigid, others twisted at unnatural angles. Saddles, broken weapons, and torn equipment littered the snow. Clothing had been stripped from most of the dead, leaving pale forms against the stained ground. Men in the recovery party moved among the bodies, searching for any sign of life. They found none. The relief column had been annihilated. Officers and enlisted men lay intermingled, their positions reflecting the confusion of the final moments rather than any formal line. Some lay alone, cut down while trying to move across open ground. Others lay in small groups, backs to one another, showing where men had gathered and fought until the very end. The detachment recognized faces and forms from barracks and mess tables now marked beyond question by the violence that had been used after death. The work of the recovery began under a sky already dulling toward evening. Men lifted bodies onto blankets and carried them to the waiting wagons. Where the ground allowed, wagons were driven as close as possible to clusters of dead to spare the carriers some of the distance. In rougher sections, the men had to haul their comrades over uneven snow and frozen ruts, boots slipping and breath burning in their chests. Officers tried to keep count of how many bodies had been found, matching names to the relief roster as best they could. The final tally confirmed that the entire command was gone. Some details of the scene fixed themselves in memory. On one small rise, the slopes around Wheatley and Fisher's last position held a dense scatter of fallen attackers, as well as the two civilians themselves. The concentration of bodies there told Ten Eyck's men how fiercely that spot had been defended. On another part of the ridge, they found Fetterman and Brown lying close together, their bodies bearing many wounds. Nearby, the remains of cavalrymen and infantry showed where the front of the fight had finally broken. At another location, they found the young bugler Metzger, his bugle still near him, his uniform damaged yet partly shielded. To the men who lifted him, these details did not form tactical lessons. They formed a ledger of the price that had been paid. Light failed rapidly on the winter basin. The low sun scraped the horizon, casting long shadows from the ridges and bodies. Ten Eyck knew that to linger too long in that exposed ground risked another attack. He set his men to loading as many of the dead as the wagons could carry and then ordered a withdrawal back up Lodge Trail Ridge. Not every body could be treated with the care that any soldier would wish for a comrade. Some had to be laid in the wagons in tight rows. There was no time to linger over individuals. The aim was to bring the fallen within the fort's reach before darkness locked the country in cold that would make movement even more deadly. The climb back to the ridge and then down toward Fort Phil Kearny took place in near silence. Men in the detachment spoke little. The creak of wagon axles and the labored breathing of the mule teams filled the air. In the wagons, the bodies of the dead shifted slightly with each jolt of the wheels. Frost began to form again along the traces as the last of the daylight vanished. Above the column, the stars came out hard and bright in the clear sky, indifferent to what moved below. Inside the fort, news reached Carrington before the recovery party did. Scouts and runners moving faster than the heavy wagons brought word that Ten Eyck had found the relief destroyed and was bringing bodies back. The commanding officer ordered preparations for their reception. A section of the parade ground was cleared. Boards were laid ready to receive the dead so that identification could be carried out under lamplight. Surgeons readied their limited facilities to handle any wounded who might still arrive, though in their hearts they already suspected that no living man would be carried in. When the gate opened and Ten Eyck's detachment returned, the scene inside the stockade changed in an instant. Wagons rolled into the parade ground, their loads concealed under blankets and bits of canvas. Men gathered without formal parade, crowding in until officers ordered them to clear space. Under the light of lanterns and torches, the coverings were drawn back. The forms beneath lay stiff in the cold. Faces that had joked in barracks and stood inspection on the same ground now looked upward without seeing. Identification went on into the evening. Officers and men moved along the rows, naming those they recognized and marking names off lists. The work had to be done despite the condition of many bodies. The customs practiced on the field outside the fort left wounds that were hard to look at directly. For the garrison, these marks erased any last trace of distance between themselves and the fighting that had surrounded them for months. What had been a contest of signals, raids, and distant rifle shots now lay at their feet in human form. Carrington faced his surviving officers in a council that night. The loss of the relief meant that his effective strength had been cut deeply. The fort now held fewer trained soldiers than at any time since its construction. If the allied Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho force chose to follow their victory by storming the stockade, the defenders would face them with thinner lines on the walls and fewer reserves. The commander ordered every able-bodied man to stand ready through the night. All leaves from duty ended. Families were instructed to prepare for the worst. Within the officers' quarters and the small houses of enlisted families, the atmosphere turned to a waiting that felt almost physical. Women gathered children and kept them inside, away from windows. Candles burned late as mothers laid out spare clothing and blankets near cellars and protected corners, places they imagined might offer some shelter if the walls were breached. Some officers quietly discussed what would happen if the fort fell, including the possibility of using the powder magazine as a last resort rather than see their families taken. Those conversations remained behind closed doors, but the weight of them touched every room. On the walls, sentries peered into the dark until their eyes ached. Beyond the stockade, fires flared briefly along distant ridges and then went out. The men on watch did not know whether those lights marked small parties of warriors returning to camps or scouts testing the fort's reaction. They knew only that an enemy force strong enough to wipe out an entire relief column now moved somewhere beyond their sight. Each man on the firing step understood that if a decisive assault came in the night, the wall where he stood might be the only barrier between his family and the riders outside. Every available weapon was checked again. Springfield rifle muskets were inspected, wiped, and loaded. Ammunition was distributed to ensure that each firing port had enough cartridges within arm's reach. The small artillery pieces at the corners of the fort were laid and relayed on likely avenues of approach. Gunners ran their hands over the iron barrels and tested the traverse of the carriages in the tight space between the inner wall and the parapet. The cold stiffened hands but kept powder dry. Hours passed without a major assault. Now and then a horse's whinny or a faint shout carried in from the darkness, but no mass of riders appeared. Inside the stockade, men waited in that peculiar strain where nothing happens except the continuation of fear. The bodies of the dead remained on the parade ground, shrouded once more, watched over by small details who had drawn the worst duty of the night. Lanterns burned low near them, casting limited circles of light that made the darkness beyond seem even deeper. For the families in the fort, the night stretched with no clear end. Children, sensing the mood of the adults, cried quietly until exhaustion pulled them into uneasy sleep. Their mothers sat with their backs to interior walls, listening for any sound that would tell them the attack had begun. Some clutched small keepsakes brought from posts farther east, tangible reminders that there had been days when duty meant drill, guard shifts, and routine chores, not the constant threat of annihilation. Near midnight, frost formed again along the inside of window frames and on the beams of the stockade. The temperature dropped further. Men on the walls stamped their feet and swung their arms to keep blood moving. Breath from their mouths and noses froze in thin layers on their scarves and coat collars. Torch flames burned smaller as pitch and cloth were consumed. Still no assault came. The warriors who had destroyed Fetterman's command had chosen not to batter themselves against the high log walls, at least not on that night. By the time a gray band of light appeared once more on the eastern horizon, the defenders at Fort Phil Kearny had stood through one of the longest nights of their lives. The fort still stood, walls unbreached, guns in place. Inside, however, the garrison had been altered permanently. 81 men were gone from the rolls, their absence marked not only in the rows of bodies ready for burial, but in the spaces at mess tables and the gaps in files at morning formation. The men who remained had spent the night surrounded by the physical fact of that loss, listening for a second blow that did not fall. Outside the stockade, the land bore its own marks. Tracks from hundreds of ponies led away toward the north. The basin near Peno Creek held the imprint of the fight, its snow shredded and stained. The Powder River country around Fort Phil Kearny now contained a place where an entire relief force had died within sightless range of the very post it had left to protect. That reality would shape every decision the fort's officers and men made through the rest of the winter. It would also travel along the trails eastward, carried in reports and letters that told of a battle where native warriors had struck with such force that not one man in the relief remained alive to tell his own story. The column under Fetterman dropped farther into the hollow that led toward Peno Creek, the ridge behind them shrinking until it was only a pale line against the winter sky. The ground opened into a wide basin broken by low ridges and shallow gullies. Snow lay in irregular patches, thin on south-facing slopes and deeper where shadows held it. The decoy riders who had teased the cavalry along the crest now widened the distance between themselves and the blue-coated men. They fired occasional shots over their shoulders, then leaned low over their ponies' necks and ran, drawing the chase deeper into the basin. Grumman pushed his troopers hard. The cavalry line stretched as faster horses and more forceful riders surged ahead. Carbines bounced in their scabbards. Men shouted to one another, voices tight with a mix of anger and eagerness. They had been told many times that the country around Fort Phil Kearny swarmed with hostile warriors. Now they believed that they saw a small cluster in flight and felt that a firm strike could punish them. In that moment, the lessons of the earlier ambush on Lodge Trail Ridge faded behind the immediate urge to close with an enemy who seemed to be running. Behind the cavalry, the infantry pushed over the last slope and down into the same basin at a slower pace. Fetterman and Captain Frederick Brown moved along the line, urging men to keep formation as the descent pulled at their legs. Rifle muskets weighed heavily on shoulders. Cartridge boxes thumped each time boots struck the crusted snow. The gap between horsemen and foot soldiers widened, despite the officers' effort to keep the two elements within supporting distance. The 81 men who had left the fort together no longer formed a compact body. They were now two separate groups, one mounted and pressing forward, the other on foot and struggling to keep up. The land around them seemed to shift as they advanced. From the ridge, the basin had looked like an open dish. On the floor of that basin, it became a maze. Small ridges rose just high enough to hide anything behind them. Gullies cut through the snow in winding lines, their sides steep enough in places to give cover to men lying flat or crouched with rifles ready. Clumps of sage and brush, dark against the white ground, offered more concealment. To men unused to the country, the space felt open enough. To those who had studied it for years, it was a perfect place to close a trap. At a signal passed from rider to rider, the decoy party shifted its pace. Instead of merely staying out of range, they slowed and bunched slightly, making themselves look less orderly. One or two pretended to have trouble with their mounts, turning their ponies in awkward circles and glancing back as if in fear. A few dismounted for several steps, then scrambled into the saddle again. From the viewpoint of Grumman's leading troopers, the scene in front of them looked like the confusion of men who were losing nerve. Cavalry spurred forward to take advantage of what they thought would be a break. The first sign that the basin held more than scattered riders came in the form of a single shot from an unexpected angle. A trooper near the front of the line jerked in his saddle as a bullet struck him from the right. His horse veered, stumbled, and went down, throwing him into the snow. Before his nearest comrades could turn toward the source of the shot, arrows hissed in from the opposite flank. Two more men went down, one with an arrow buried deep in his side. Shouts of warning cut across the line. The sense of open pursuit vanished in an instant, replaced by the sharp understanding that they were receiving fire from both sides. On the ridges flanking the basin, warriors rose from cover in numbers that none of the soldiers had seen before in this campaign. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho men who had waited motionless behind rocks and brush now stood or mounted and came forward. They had painted faces during the night and tied feathers and cloth to their hair and horses. Rifles, muskets, and bows appeared where moments before there had been only patches of brush and snow. Shots came from high ground on both sides, and more riders poured into view from behind the low hills ahead. Grumman tried to pull his cavalry into a tighter formation, but the attack broke the line before it could fully react. Horses flinched under incoming fire. Some reared and spun. Others dropped as bullets or arrows struck them, crashing into nearby animals and tangling riders in straps and stirrups. Men tried to wheel into a coherent front, but fire came from so many directions that there was no clear way to face it. A trooper who turned his horse toward the right found warriors closing from that side. Another who aimed his mount straight ahead saw more riders pouring down from the higher ground in front. In the chaos, some cavalrymen dismounted to try to fight on foot, using their fallen horses as cover. They snapped open the breech of their carbines, shoved in cartridges, and fired as fast as they could work the levers. 7-shot Spencers gave them the ability to send a small stream of bullets toward groups of warriors who tried to rush in. For a few brief moments, the air filled with the heavy thud of carbine fire as men tried to carve space for themselves. But each burst of shots consumed precious ammunition, and each man on foot now had less chance to escape if attackers closed the distance. As the cavalry struggled, Fetterman's infantry reached the edge of the basin and saw the fight fully formed. From their position, they could see cavalry horses plunging, warriors sweeping in from both flanks, and the decoy party now turning to join the attack. Fetterman understood at once that the mounted part of his force was on the brink of being cut into small pieces. He and Brown ordered the infantry into a line on a low ridge that rose near the center of the basin floor. The soldiers spread along the slope, facing outward on both sides, trying to form a rough arc that could cover the men still alive in the valley below. Under the whip of shouted commands, infantrymen dropped to one knee or lay prone, resting rifle muskets along the ridgeline. Cartridge boxes snapped open. Powder and ball came out in quick handfuls. Men tore open paper cartridges with their teeth, poured powder into barrels, rammed bullets home, and capped their weapons. The first volley cracked along the ridge in a jagged line. Heavy conical bullets reached out toward riders closing on the cavalry, knocking some from their saddles and forcing others to veer off for a moment. The infantry's fire bought a few breaths of space as the attacking warriors adjusted to the new threat on the higher ground. For a short time, the battle broke into distinct zones. Near the lower part of the basin, scattered knots of cavalrymen fought in small clusters, some still mounted, others behind fallen horses. On the ridge, the infantry held a more solid line, sending measured fire into any group that approached within musket range. Between these two areas, Wheatley and Fisher chose their ground. They moved to a rocky knoll slightly ahead of the main ridge, a spot that gave them a clear field of fire on most of the approaches from the north and east. From there, their 16-shot Henry rifles could reach any group of warriors attempting to close on the ridge in larger numbers. Once in position, Wheatley and Fisher began to work their rifles in a steady rhythm. The Henry lever cycled again and again, each stroke feeding a fresh cartridge into the chamber. Shots came so fast from their knoll that warriors later recalled hearing a constant rattle from that one point. Men and horses fell in the arcs they covered. Whenever a cluster of riders tried to group for a charge toward the ridge, a burst of fire from the two civilians tore into the formation, scattering it and leaving bodies on the snow. For a period measured only in minutes, those two rifles formed a pivot around which the rest of the position held. War leaders among the attackers saw at once that the hill where Wheatley and Fisher fired from would have to be dealt with. The pattern of bodies around it showed how effective their fire had become. Commands passed among the warriors. Rather than continue to feed men into that particular zone, they shifted their rushes to hit weaker points in the infantry line, probing for any place where rates of fire dropped or men seemed thinner. Most of the cavalry fight had already broken down into isolated last stands. The main pressure now turned toward the ridge where Fetterman and Brown directed the infantry. On that ridge, the infantry's disadvantage in rate of fire became painfully clear. Each Springfield rifle musket could send out only one shot at a time, and each shot took long seconds to reload under the crushing strain of battle. Men bit cartridges until their lips bled. Powder spilled on the snow and on gloved fingers. Ramrods flashed up and down. Caps were pressed onto nipples with cold, stiffened hands that sometimes fumbled and dropped them. During the loading cycle, warriors used the lull to dash from one patch of cover to another, closing the distance bit by bit. When the next volley came, some went down. The rest used any dead space in the firing to move closer. Crazy Horse and other leaders rode within sight of the ridge to keep the attack coordinated. They did not throw their men blindly into a wall of bullets. Instead, they concentrated force where single soldiers or small clusters had to reload at different times. From one angle, riders would make a sudden rush, drawing fire. From another, men on foot crept uphill under the cover of that distraction, using wind-formed drifts and low shrubs as steps in their climb. Arrows came in a steady arc, dropping among the infantry and forcing some men to flinch or duck just when they most needed to aim. The cavalry remnants tried to fall back toward the ridge. Some men on surviving horses made short, desperate rides uphill, leaning low over their mounts' necks, trying to reach the relative shelter of the infantry line. Warriors spotted each attempt and raced to intercept. In some cases, horses reached the slope with mortally wounded riders who slid from the saddles as soon as they arrived. In others, men never made it, cut down in the open and left to lie where they fell. The closeness of the fight turned the basin into a patchwork of small, separate dying grounds rather than a single ordered field. Bugler Adolf Metzger found himself within the collapsing cavalry sector. When his horse went down under him, he scrambled to his feet with his bugle and sidearm. Accounts from both sides later spoke of a young man who refused to run, who instead took a stand with whatever weapon came to hand. He fired as long as his revolver held cartridges. When that emptied, he swung the bugle as a club, striking at men who rushed him. Warriors who closed with him saw a figure in uniform fighting hand to hand in the snow. When he finally fell, his body bore many wounds, yet his clothing remained less torn than those of some others near him. A Cheyenne warrior later covered him with a buffalo hide, an act that reflected a measure of respect for the way he had fought. On Wheatley and Fisher's Hill, the strain began to tell. Their Henry rifles had poured out scores of shots. The brass cartridges that had seemed plentiful at first dwindled rapidly. Empty cases lay scattered at their feet, cooling in the snow. Each time they worked the lever and heard the click of the hammer fall on an empty chamber, they knew their advantage was shrinking. They continued to fire as long as any cartridges remained, shifting aim constantly to hit whichever group of attackers seemed closest to breaking through elsewhere. Warriors learned to time their movements between volleys, rushing in closer, while the two men reloaded their magazines. When the cartridges finally ran out, Wheatley and Fisher had no time to shift to other weapons effectively. Warriors who had been held back by their constant firing now surged toward the knoll from multiple sides. Some later accounts described the two civilians drawing sidearms. Others described them swinging their empty rifles as clubs. The exact sequence vanished in the confusion, but when the rush hit, the hilltop disappeared under a wave of men. Afterward, bodies lay thick on that small rise, showing how hard the attackers had had to work to silence the two rapid-firing rifles. Wheatley and Fisher themselves died there, surrounded by enemy dead and dying, their own forms bearing many wounds. With the repeaters silenced, pressure on the main infantry line increased. Warriors made closer runs at the ridge, some reaching points where they could fire into the soldiers at much shorter range. A few gained positions slightly below and to the side of the ridge from which they could angle fire up into the line. Each man hit in the infantry ranks left a gap that his neighbors had to cover. The line thinned, and the intervals between men grew larger. Fetterman and Brown moved along the ridge, trying to steady their soldiers and direct fire into the places where the attacks were heaviest, but the sheer weight of men coming in from multiple directions pressed on them. At some point in the fighting, the infantry line collapsed fully into several tight clusters rather than a continuous front. Little groups of soldiers fell back to the nearest scrap of cover, some to small rock outcrops, others to depressions in the ridge itself. In these last positions, men stood or knelt shoulder to shoulder, backs to one another, firing in different directions until they could no longer load. They knew there would be no escape. The country they had come into held too many attackers and offered no clear path back to the ridgeline. The attackers closed into very short range. Shots from rifles and carbines now came at distances where powder burns could mark clothing. Arrows drove in at angles that pierced through limbs and bodies. When ammunition ran out, some soldiers swung rifles as clubs, smashing stocks against skulls and shoulders until the weapons broke. Others drew bayonets and pistols in final attempts to hold off the press of men. Warriors answered with lances, war clubs, knives, and their own firearms. The fight turned into a series of separate hand-to-hand struggles scattered across the basin and ridge. Time in such a battle cannot be counted by clock marks, only by the shrinking number of men still on their feet. Early reports and later reconstructions agree that the entire fight lasted less than 1 hour, from the first closing of the trap to the final death in the command. In that brief span, every one of the 81 men in Fetterman's relief force fell. Officers and enlisted men, cavalry and infantry, civilian volunteers and the young bugler all lay dead or dying along the basin floor, on the slope of the ridge and on the hill where the repeaters had stood. After the last shot ceased, the basin filled with different sounds. Warriors moved among the bodies, calling to one another in their own languages, looking for wounded comrades, counting the cost of the victory. Some men lay still in the snow, their blood dark against the white ground. Others groaned and tried to rise, only to be pushed back. Horses, both army mounts and Indian ponies, stood or stumbled with wounds that would soon bring them down. Then the customs of plains warfare took hold. For generations, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors had marked victories not just by the number of enemies killed, but by the honors taken from those enemies. Men stripped weapons, belts, and cartridge boxes from the dead. They cut long locks of hair from heads that had once been covered by army caps. Some bodies were pierced or slashed in ways that, to the warriors, meant an assurance that the enemy's spirit would not easily trouble them. To the soldiers who would later find those bodies, the marks would appear as acts of deliberate insult and cruelty. Not everybody received the same treatment. Some warriors believed that the courage shown by particular opponents merited different handling. Metzger's partially covered form offered one example. Other bodies carried fewer cuts, and men in native camps said that those enemies had shown strong resistance. Such distinctions would matter little to the officers and men at Fort Phil Kearny who later saw the aftermath. They would see only the stripped and torn remains of comrades scattered across a wide, icy basin. As the day moved toward midday, the warriors began to gather their own dead. The cost of closing the trap had not come without payment. Men had been hit by rifle muskets, carbines, and the streams of bullets from Wheatley and Fisher's Henry rifles. Some lay in the snow near the ridge. Others had fallen farther out, where the first volleys from the infantry had reached them. Their bodies were lifted onto ponies or dragged onto travois for the journey back toward winter camps. Women and elders there would count those losses as part of the price paid to keep the Powder River country free of the new road and its forts. When the last of the wounded had been removed and most of the useful gear had been taken from the dead, many warriors rode to the higher ground to look back toward the line of Lodge Trail Ridge and the distant dark shape of Fort Phil Kearny. Smoke from the stockade's chimneys still rose calmly into the sky. From this distance, the fort looked unchanged, its strong walls and ordered interior giving no sign of the destruction that had taken place beyond the hills. Between the basin of death near Peno Creek and the log walls, the country lay quiet for the moment, a strip of plains that had just swallowed an entire column of soldiers without leaving any trace visible from the post they had left. The prophecy spoken in winter council lodges of 100 soldiers lying in native hands had not matched the exact number of men in Fetterman's command, but the meaning felt fulfilled. A full relief force had been drawn out, cut off, and destroyed. The Army's belief that it could send men into the Powder River country and impose its will by force had met a hard check. In the cold air above Peno Creek, the evidence lay on the ground in the form of 81 still bodies, each one a life taken in the struggle over whose law would rule the land between the Bighorn foothills and the Powder River basin. On the morning of December 22, 1866, Fort Phil Kearny stood under a sky as hard and pale as the day before. Inside the stockade, the bodies of the 81 dead from Fetterman's command lay on the frozen parade ground, wrapped in blankets and canvas. Men moved among them with wooden boards and rough coffins, working with numb hands. Chaplains read prayers in low voices. Shovels rang against frozen earth outside the walls as burial details began to open graves that would barely take the stiff forms. The fort had survived the night without a direct assault, but every corner of the post carried the weight of the disaster beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. Carrington knew the news could not remain within the stockade. The department headquarters far to the south had to hear the full account of what had happened. Telegraph lines did not yet reach Fort Phil Kearny. The nearest wire lay at Fort Laramie, more than 200 miles away through winter country. A written dispatch had to be carried there by hand. Any messenger would have to cross ground watched by the same warriors who had destroyed Fetterman's command. The ride would demand endurance, knowledge of the trails, and a willingness to risk death at any hour. Attention turned to a civilian present at the fort whose skill as a rider and frontiersman was well known. John Portuguese Phillips had been born Manuel Felipe Cardoso in the Azores, had grown up near the Missouri River, and had worked as a hunter and guide along the overland routes. He knew the country between the Powder River and the Platte, and had already carried messages between distant posts. When the need for a courier arose, he stepped forward. Carrington prepared a detailed report, sealed it in oilskin, and entrusted it to Phillips along with verbal instructions to carry the news to Fort Laramie without delay. That night, with the cold deepening and clouds beginning to gather, Phillips left Fort Phil Kearny. He rode a strong horse and led a second, knowing the first mount would wear out under the strain. The gate closed behind him, cutting off the light and noise of the crowded stockade. Ahead lay miles of open country broken by rivers, ridges, and ravines, and patrolled by warriors who had little reason to let any messenger pass. Phillips guided his horse along routes that kept him away from the Bozeman Trail whenever possible, choosing side draws and higher benches where he could see trouble coming. The ride turned into a continuous struggle against distance, cold, and exhaustion. Phillips crossed the Powder River under ice and wind, then pushed on toward the North Platte. Snow fell at times in hard, fine grains that stung his face and obscured distant shapes. At night he rode under stars and a thin moon, stopping only long enough to rest his horses and snatch brief periods of sleep. When one mount grew too tired to continue, he shifted to the other. He crossed country where any fire would be visible, for long distances, so he went without cooking, relying on cold food carried from the fort and what little he could gather along the way. Days later, near the Christmas season, he reached the area around Fort Laramie. Contemporary accounts placed his arrival in the midst of a gathering at the post where officers and families had begun a modest holiday celebration. He rode into the fort with clothing stiff from frost and horses worn down by the journey. The sealed dispatch he carried ended any feeling of festivity. Commanders at Fort Laramie read Carrington's report and learned that an entire relief column had been wiped out near Peno Creek. The news began to move east by telegraph that same day, reaching Omaha, then Chicago, and then Washington in rapid sequence. In the weeks that followed, newspapers in eastern cities printed long accounts of the fight that they soon called the Fetterman Massacre. Some drew heavily on early reports and on Phillips's arrival story, highlighting the distance he had ridden and the severity of the defeat. Headlines spoke of an army detachment cut to pieces, and of the mutilated bodies brought back to the fort. Editorials argued fiercely over what the disaster meant. Some blamed Carrington, accusing him of poor leadership and weak action. Others pointed to government policies that had pushed roads and forts into key native hunting grounds and then expected small garrisons to hold them without adequate support. Army authorities opened investigations. Carrington traveled east in early 1867 to present his defense before boards of inquiry. He pointed to orders received from higher command, to the poor quality of many of his recruits, and to the pressure placed on him to protect a long road with limited men and supplies. He insisted that his standing orders had prohibited crossing Lodge Trail Ridge, and that those orders had been violated in the field. Other officers disagreed with his assessment and testimony. In the end, criticism and public pressure led to his removal from the frontier command. Different officers took over at Fort Phil Kearny and along the Bozeman Trail, bringing changes in tactics and technology. The Army's response to the disaster included a decision to rearm the garrisons with more modern weapons. Shipments of breech-loading rifles arrived in the northern plains during 1867. Many infantrymen at Fort Phil Kearny and other posts along the Bozeman Trail exchanged their old muzzle-loading Springfield rifle muskets for converted Springfield breech-loaders, often called needle guns, which could be loaded from the rear with metal cartridges. Cavalry units received additional Spencer repeaters. These weapons allowed soldiers to fire more quickly and reload while lying prone behind cover, a crucial advantage in fights where attackers closed the distance in fast rushes. During the spring and summer of 1867, the forts along the Bozeman Trail remained under constant strain. Civilian travel on the road had almost stopped. Freighters and emigrants who had once tried to use the route now avoided it, choosing longer but safer paths. The chain of posts along the trail, including Fort Reno on the Powder River and Fort C.F. Smith on the Bighorn, depended on heavily guarded military convoys for supplies. Native warriors continued to strike at hayfields, wood trains, and small details whenever they saw an opening. The Fetterman fight had not ended the contest for the Powder River country. It had hardened positions on both sides. In July 1867, a large attack fell on a hay-cutting party near Fort C.F. Smith on the Bighorn River. Soldiers and civilian contractors had gone out to cut and stack hay for the post's animals, escorted by a small detachment armed with the new breech-loading rifles. Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors attacked in strength, expecting to overwhelm the party in open ground. The defenders formed tight positions behind improvised breastworks of hay bales and earth and used their breech-loaders to maintain a continuous fire. Repeated charges broke against their line, and after hours of fighting, the attackers pulled back, leaving a field marked by many casualties. The hayfield fight, as it became known, showed that in prepared positions, small groups of soldiers with new rifles could hold against larger forces. A few weeks later, on August 2nd, 1867, another major clash occurred within sight of Fort Phil Kearny. A work party had gone out to cut timber, protected by a small detachment that took shelter inside a rough corral made from wagon boxes set in a circle on low ground near the Pinery Road. The men inside the wagon box corral carried the new Springfield breech loaders. When Lakota and Cheyenne warriors launched a massive attack, they expected to overrun the position as they had overrun earlier parties armed with muzzle loaders. Instead, they met a steady wall of rapid fire. Soldiers inside the corral could fire, reload, and fire again without standing up, placing a heavy stream of bullets into any group that tried to rush the position. The battle around the wagon boxes lasted for hours. Warriors charged repeatedly, some reaching the outer edges of the corral, only to be driven back by concentrated fire from the breech loaders. The small artillery pieces at Fort Phil Kearny joined in, sending shells into attacking groups when they came within range. By the time the attackers withdrew, the defenders had lost only a few men, while the attackers left many bodies scattered across the ground. The wagon box fight entered Army records as a demonstration that with new weapons and well-chosen defensive arrangements, small garrisons could stand against large native forces in open country. These later fights did not erase the memory of the Fetterman disaster, but they changed the character of the struggle. For Native leaders, the heavy casualties at the hayfield and wagon box fights showed that the balance of firepower had shifted. The new breech-loading rifles allowed small numbers of soldiers to deliver more shots than their earlier weapons had permitted. Plains tactics that relied on massed charges against positions that had once been vulnerable now encountered concentrated fire from men who did not have to expose themselves to reload. In council lodges during the winters that followed, these facts shaped decisions as much as any earlier success. At the same time, events far from the Powder River country influenced the direction of the conflict. The Transcontinental Railroad drove westward across Nebraska and into Wyoming, opening a steel path that carried settlers, freight, and troops more quickly than any wagon road. The federal government created an Indian Peace Commission to examine the causes of continued war on the plains and to recommend new arrangements. Reports from that commission recognized that the Bozeman Trail ran directly through the best remaining hunting ground of the Lakota and their allies, and that holding the line of forts along that trail would require constant fighting. Some commissioners argued that it would cost less in lives and money to abandon the trail and its posts than to keep them at all costs. In early 1868, peace talks centered on the old meeting ground at Fort Laramie. Government negotiators arrived with a new treaty draft that offered a different framework. The United States agreed to close the Bozeman Trail to civilian travel and to abandon the forts in the Powder River country. The treaty recognized a large reservation for the Lakota along the Missouri River and set aside the Black Hills in the Powder River region as unceded hunting territory, where no white settlement would be allowed without native consent. In return, Lakota leaders would accept agencies and annuity goods and would end active warfare along main routes. Red Cloud refused to sign while soldiers still occupied forts on his hunting ground. He remained away from Fort Laramie during the early treaty sessions. Other Lakota leaders signed, as did representatives of the Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho, but Red Cloud's absence kept the central question open. He had fought a war to remove soldiers from the Powder River country. In his view, signatures on paper meant little if the forts still stood and the road remained open. Only after clear proof came that the Army would abandon the Bozeman Trail posts did he agree to place his mark on the agreement. That proof came in the form of withdrawal orders. In the summer of 1868, the Army evacuated Fort C.F. Smith, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort Reno. At each post, commanders packed what equipment and records they could onto wagons and prepared the structures for abandonment. At Fort Phil Kearny, soldiers piled combustible material inside empty buildings and along stockade walls. When the last detachments formed on the parade ground, fires were set. Flames climbed the pine logs that had taken so many months to cut and raise. Smoke rose over the valley where so many fights had centered around wood trains and hay fields. Then the column marched away toward the south, leaving the burning fort behind. From nearby hills and valleys, Lakota and Cheyenne watchers saw the smoke and moved closer. When the garrisons were gone, warriors and families entered the abandoned sites. Any structures that still stood were pulled down or burned. Iron fittings, stoves, and remnants of tools were carried away. The great stockades that had once symbolized the Army's intent to hold the Bozeman Trail vanished into charred posts and scattered debris. In their place, the Powder River country returned for a time to the pattern of native camps and hunting parties following the movements of game. On April 29, 1868, Red Cloud signed the Fort Laramie Treaty. The document recorded the removal of soldiers from the Powder River region and the closing of the Bozeman Trail. For the first and only time in the history of the Northern Plains, a war led by a native alliance had ended, with the United States abandoning forts and roads that had been the immediate cause of conflict and acknowledging, in formal language, native control over a broad stretch of contested country. In Lakota memory, this stood as proof that determined resistance, organized across bands and supported by careful tactics, could force a powerful enemy to retreat. In Army records and among settlers, the Fetterman fight remained a bitter example of what happened when small forces moved into hostile country without strict discipline and full understanding of the terrain and the enemy. Officers studying the battle in later years pointed to the decision to cross Lodge Trail Ridge against orders, the separation of cavalry and infantry, and the failure to appreciate the effect of decoys. They also noted the shift that followed when the introduction of breech-loading rifles and improved defensive positions changed later engagements at the wagon box and hayfield fights. The lessons written in blood near Peno Creek shaped training and doctrine for frontier units long after the Bozeman Trail had fallen quiet. For the families who had lived inside Fort Phil Kearny, the memory of those years held sharper edges. Widows and children carried with them recollections of nights when the walls shook with distant gunfire, when burial details left through the gate in thin light and returned with wagons full of dead, and when entire companies vanished beyond a ridge and did not come back. Their stories joined the letters and reports that circulated in the East and helped form the wider country's image of the Northern Plains as a place where lines drawn on maps could cost entire commands on cold winter days. For Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho families, the same period held memories of camps in the shelter of timbered valleys, of long councils where leaders debated war and peace, of rides in bitter cold to strike wood trains and patrols, and of seeing the tall walls of the forts burn and fall. The Fetterman fight, the later battles around the Bozeman Trail posts, and the treaty that followed became part of a larger story of defense of land and life against an expanding power. Children in those camps grew up hearing accounts of Crazy Horse's decoy ride, of the closing of the trap near Peno Creek, of the concentrated fire from the wagon box corral, and of the day Red Cloud signed a treaty only after the soldiers had gone. By the time the last embers of the abandoned forts cooled and new grass grew through the charred timbers, the Powder River country had confirmed a hard truth. Soldiers who thought they had taken the land with stockades, roads, and paper orders had learned that control required more than posts and patrols. Native warriors who struck back in force along the Bozeman Trail had, for a decisive period, reasserted their hold on the valleys and ridges between the Bighorn Mountains and the Powder River. The Fetterman fight, Phillips's winter ride, the later battles around wagon boxes and hayfields, and the burning and emptying of the forts all formed one continuous chain of events that ended with the land, for a time, in the hands of those who had fought for it the longest.